Hello and welcome back. Tonight we're going to talk about something that sits right at the edge of the known and the unknown. UFO stories from around our world. Not the sensationalized tales you might find on late-night television, but the documented encounters, the unexplained moments captured by credible witnesses, and the quiet mysteries that make us wonder what else might be sharing the sky above us. If you enjoy these journeys into the contemplative corners of science and mystery, consider leaving a like on this video and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this one. It helps others find their way here to this quiet space we've carved out together. Now let's begin. Language matters, doesn't it? The words we choose shape how we think about things, how we categorize them in our minds, how seriously we take them. And in 1952, the United States Air Force understood this when they decided to change what they called those strange objects people kept reporting in the skies. Before 1952, the popular term was flying saucer, a phrase that had emerged just 5 years earlier when a pilot named Kenneth Arnold described objects moving like a saucer would if you skipped it across water. It was catchy, vivid, almost playful, but it came with baggage. When you say flying saucer, you're already halfway to assuming what you're looking at. Something disc-shaped, something constructed, something from somewhere else. The term carried implications that the Air Force wanted to step away from, so they created a new acronym, UFO, Unidentified Flying Object. 3 words that say almost nothing except the most basic truth. We don't know what this is. It's in the air. We can't identify it. That's all. No assumptions about alien spacecraft, no commitments to extraterrestrial visitors, just uncertainty wrapped in official-sounding letters. And here's what's interesting about that shift. Most UFO reports, when investigated thoroughly, turn out to be entirely ordinary things seen under extraordinary circumstances. A weather balloon caught an unusual light, the planet Venus hanging bright and low on the horizon, flickering through atmospheric turbulence. An aircraft at just the right angle, its metallic surface reflecting the sun in a way that makes it seem to glow with its own internal fire. Clouds shaped by wind into formations that look impossibly geometric. Satellites tumbling through their orbits, flashing as they spin. The universe, it turns out, doesn't need alien visitors to be strange. It's already quite strange enough on its own. The familiar can become unfamiliar with just a shift in perspective, a change in lighting, a moment where your brain reaches for an explanation and comes up empty. And maybe that's what most UFO sightings really are. Not evidence of visitors from other worlds, but evidence of how wonderfully mysterious our own world can be. How easily the ordinary can become extraordinary when we see it from an unexpected angle. The Air Force knew this. They knew that most sightings would have prosaic explanations, but they also knew that the human impulse to look up at something unexplainable and wonder, really wonder, was worth taking seriously, worth investigating, worth giving a proper name to, even if that name was deliberately vague, deliberately open-ended. So when you hear UFO, remember what it really means. Not alien spacecraft, but simply, we don't know yet. And there's something almost meditative about that, isn't there? A reminder that it's okay not to have all the answers immediately. That mystery can exist without necessarily implying anything more than our own temporary ignorance. Sometimes the sky holds secrets. Sometimes those secrets are just weather balloons, And sometimes, just sometimes, they remain secrets a little while longer. Imagine waking up on an April morning in 1561 in the medieval city of Nuremberg, Germany. You step outside as the sun rises, expecting the ordinary progression of dawn. Perhaps some early morning mist, the calls of vendors beginning their day, the comfortable predictability of another sunrise in a world where most things happened as they always had. But this morning, the sky had other plans. What the citizens of Nuremberg witnessed that day, on April 14th, has echoed down through the centuries in one of the most striking pieces of evidence we have of unexplained aerial phenomena in the pre-industrial age. They saw what they described as an aerial battle: spheres, cylinders, crosses, and other geometric shapes appearing in the sky around the rising sun, seeming to move with purpose, to engage with one another. Some witnesses said the objects appeared to be fighting, while others watched what looked like tubes and globes crossing back and forth across the sky for over an hour. The event was significant enough that a local printer named Hans Glaser created a woodcut to document it, and this image has survived the centuries. If you've ever seen it, it's quite striking. The sky filled with geometric forms, cylinders that might be described as cigar-shaped, a term that would recur in UFO reports 4 centuries later, spheres of different sizes, crosses, and what appeared to be 2 large structures flanking the sun itself. The woodcut shows some of these objects appearing to crash or fall to earth, trailing smoke or fire. The accompanying text, translated from medieval German, describes the objects with a mixture of wonder and religious interpretation, as you might expect from that era. The witnesses seemed genuinely shaken by what they'd seen, interpreting it through the lens of their time, perhaps as a sign from God, a portent of change, a celestial warning. They had no framework for understanding aircraft or atmospheric phenomena in the way we do now, so they reached for the explanations available to them. Modern researchers, looking back at this event with the benefit of contemporary atmospheric science, have suggested it might have been a particularly dramatic example of sundogs, a phenomenon where ice crystals in the atmosphere refract sunlight, creating bright spots or even arcs and halos around the sun. On rare occasions, under the right conditions, these effects can be quite elaborate, creating multiple points of light that seem to hover around the sun, sometimes with colored halos, sometimes with pillar-like structures of light extending upward or downward. It's a compelling explanation, and it might even be correct. Sundogs can indeed create remarkable displays, and in an era before people understood atmospheric optics, such a display might well be interpreted as objects in the sky, especially if clouds or other atmospheric conditions created the illusion of movement or interaction between these bright points of light. But here's what makes this account so fascinating for our purposes tonight. We can never truly know. We can't go back and take measurements, can't interview the witnesses with our modern questions, can't point our instruments at the sky above 1561 Nuremberg. We have only their descriptions, their interpretations, their woodcut frozen in time. The event sits comfortably in that space of mystery, neither fully explainable nor completely inexplicable, and there's something almost peaceful about that uncertainty when you approach it with curiosity rather than a need for immediate answers. What we do know is that humans have always watched the sky with wonder. Long before we had the technology to fill it with our own aircraft, we were seeing things up there that puzzled us, that made us create art to document them, that made us gather and discuss and try to understand. The Nuremberg event reminds us that the impulse to look up and wonder isn't new, isn't a product of science fiction or modern mythology. It's deeply human and deeply old. Perhaps the sundog's explanation is correct, and those medieval citizens witnessed an extraordinary but entirely natural atmospheric display. Or perhaps something else was occurring that morning, something we still don't have the framework to understand. The comfortable thing about history is that we can let both possibilities exist simultaneously, appreciating the account for what it definitely is, a reminder that the sky has always held mysteries, and we have always been compelled to witness them, to record them, and to wonder. There are certain names that carry more weight than the places themselves probably deserve. Roswell, New Mexico is one of them. It's a small city in the southeastern part of the state, with a population that's never been particularly large, surrounded by ranch land and desert, the kind of place that might never have made national news at all, if not for a few summer days in 1947. What happened there, or more accurately, what people think happened there, has become perhaps the most famous UFO incident in American history, spawning decades of speculation, countless books, and documentaries, and a cultural association so strong that Roswell itself has leaned into it, with alien-themed street lamps and museums dedicated to the event. But the actual story, the documented sequence of events, is both more mundane and more interesting than the mythology that's grown up around it. In early July 1947, a rancher named Mac Brazel found debris scattered across a field on the property he managed. It was odd debris, lightweight materials, metallic-looking foil, rubber strips, and wooden sticks. Strange enough that after hearing reports of flying discs being sighted around the region, he decided to report it to the local sheriff, who in turn contacted the nearby Roswell Army Airfield. Here's where the story takes its crucial turn. The military sent an intelligence officer named Major Jesse Marcel to investigate and collect the debris. And on July 8, 1947, the public information officer at the base issued a press release that would echo through decades. It stated that the military had recovered a flying disc from a ranch near Roswell. For one extraordinary day, the official story was that the U.S. military had found a flying saucer. Newspapers ran with it. The Roswell Daily Record's headline read, "RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region." For a few hours, it seemed like the question of whether we were alone in the universe might have been answered. But then, almost as quickly, the story changed. The military issued a new statement claiming it had all been a mistake. The debris was actually from a weather balloon, a misidentification by personnel unfamiliar with such equipment. They even held a press conference, displaying weather balloon materials and suggesting this was what had caused all the confusion. Major Marcel was photographed holding pieces of what appeared to be a weather balloon, looking somewhat sheepish. And for decades, that was mostly where the story sat. There were some who didn't believe the weather balloon explanation, who thought the military had covered something up. But without additional evidence, it remained a local oddity more than a national obsession. Then, in the 1980s and 90s, the story exploded back into public consciousness as former military personnel began coming forward with accounts suggesting they'd been told to keep quiet, that there had been more to the incident than was officially reported, that they'd seen material unlike anything conventional. Books appeared claiming alien bodies had been recovered. Roswell went from a footnote to a phenomenon. In response to the renewed interest and under pressure from congressional inquiries, the U.S. military conducted new investigations in the 1990s. And these investigations revealed something that was classified in 1947, Project Mogul. This was a top-secret program designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests by floating high-altitude balloons equipped with sensitive acoustic sensors at the edge of space. These weren't ordinary weather balloons. They were trains of balloons carrying classified equipment, made with materials that would have looked unusual to someone unfamiliar with the project. According to the military's updated explanation, what crashed at Roswell was a Project Mogul balloon array. The initial weather balloon story was a cover, yes, but covering classified military technology, not extraterrestrial visitors. The strange materials witnesses described, thin metal that wouldn't wrinkle, lightweight but strong, were consistent with materials used in these classified balloon projects. So here we have a case where there was a cover-up, just not the one people imagined. The military had lied, but to protect a classified project during the early Cold War, when secrecy around nuclear detection was paramount. It's actually a fairly elegant explanation, one that accounts for the unusual materials, the initial confusion, the rapid change in the official story, and the decades of classification. Does this mean we know with absolute certainty what happened at Roswell? No. We have the military's explanation. We have witness accounts that vary widely in reliability and specificity. We have the documented facts of what was said and when. We have enough to make a reasonable conclusion, but not enough to close the book entirely. And perhaps that's fitting. What Roswell really represents isn't proof of alien visitation, or even proof of government conspiracy in the popular sense. It represents how stories take on lives of their own, how the intersection of secrecy, Cold War anxiety, and the very human desire for something extraordinary can create mythology from uncertainty. The name Roswell has become shorthand for a whole category of beliefs about hidden truths and official deception, and that cultural weight is real, even if the original event was likely just classified military technology falling from the sky into a ranch field in New Mexico. And maybe that's the lesson worth taking from this as you drift towards sleep. That sometimes the truth is neither as exciting as believers hope, nor as simple as skeptics claim. Sometimes it's just complicated, layered with classification and confusion, neither confirming our wildest dreams, nor being as transparent as we might wish. And that's okay. The universe is under no obligation to present its mysteries in neat packages, and neither, it seems, are governments protecting classified programs during times of geopolitical tension. There's something particularly credible about a UFO report from a commercial airline pilot. These are people trained to identify aircraft, familiar with atmospheric phenomena, accustomed to the strange ways light can play tricks at high altitude. They're not prone to panic or misidentification, at least no more than any other professional doing a job they've done thousands of times. So when a veteran pilot with decades of experience reports something truly unusual, it tends to carry weight. On November 17th, 1986, Japan Airlines Flight 1628 was traveling from Paris to Tokyo, carrying a cargo of Beaujolais Nouveau wine. The flight path took them over Alaska, and it was there, in the darkness above the Alaskan wilderness, that Captain Kenju Terauchi and his crew experienced something they couldn't easily explain. It began with lights. At first, the crew thought they might be military aircraft, perhaps accompanying them for some reason. But these lights behaved strangely, staying with the cargo plane for far longer than any normal escort would, and moving in ways that didn't match conventional aircraft. Terauchi described them as following his plane, matching its movements, staying at a constant distance for more than 30 minutes. Then, according to Terauchi's account, something even stranger appeared. A massive object that he described as twice the size of an aircraft carrier, with lights arranged in two rectangular formations. He used the term walnut-shaped to describe its overall form, and said it seemed to emit a warmth that he could feel through the cockpit window. His co-pilot and flight engineer confirmed they were seeing something unusual as well, though their descriptions were somewhat less detailed than the captain's. What makes this case particularly interesting is that it wasn't just visual. The objects were tracked on radar, both the plane's onboard radar and by air traffic control on the ground. The FAA radar operators in Anchorage confirmed they were seeing something near the Japan Airlines flight, though they couldn't identify what it was. When military radar was consulted, they initially reported a return as well, though this later became a point of some controversy and confusion in the official investigation. The encounter lasted long enough that Terauchi requested permission to deviate from his flight path, trying to evade or get a different view of whatever was following them. The objects stayed with the plane through these maneuvers. Finally, as the flight approached Fairbanks, the objects simply departed, moving away at high speed until they were no longer visible. Now here's where we enter the realm of explanation and interpretation. The official FAA investigation, conducted over several months, couldn't definitively identify what the crew had seen. Some investigators suggested the lights might have been reflections or refractions. The planet Jupiter was particularly bright that night, and there were ice crystals in the atmosphere that could theoretically create unusual optical effects. Military aircraft in the area could have accounted for some of what was seen and tracked on radar. But Terauchi and his crew were adamant that what they'd seen wasn't a reflection or a planet. They were experienced enough to know what Jupiter looked like, what ice crystal halos appeared like. The official report essentially concluded something unusual was observed by credible witnesses and partially confirmed by radar, but we cannot definitively identify it. There's an interesting postscript to this story. In the aftermath of the incident and the publicity it generated, Captain Terauchi was quietly reassigned to a desk job. He believed this was a punishment for speaking openly about what he'd experienced, though Japan Airlines denied any such motivation. It raises uncomfortable questions about the pressure pilots might feel to remain silent about anomalous sightings, even when those sightings might represent genuine navigation hazards, or at least phenomena worthy of investigation. The Japan Airlines encounter sits in that category of cases that's neither easily explained nor inexplicable. There are plausible conventional explanations: unusual atmospheric conditions creating optical illusions, perhaps misidentification of military activity, the tendency of human perception to turn ambiguous stimuli into coherent objects. But none of these explanations feel entirely satisfying when you read the detailed accounts, when you consider the duration of the encounter, when you remember that multiple trained observers and independent radar systems seem to detect something unusual that night. What we're left with is a well-documented case of something strange happening in the sky, reported by credible witnesses, partially corroborated by technical instruments, and ultimately left in the category of unidentified. Not proven to be extraordinary, but not satisfactorily explained as ordinary either. It's the kind of case that makes you understand why pilots, scientists, and investigators continue to take some UFO reports seriously, even while remaining appropriately skeptical of the more sensational claims. As you let this story settle in your mind, perhaps what's most remarkable is simply that the sky still holds surprises. That even in an age of satellites and sophisticated radar, of flight paths monitored minute by minute, of airspace mapped and controlled, even with all that, a commercial aircraft can encounter something that leaves experienced pilots puzzled and investigators unable to provide a definitive answer. There's something almost comforting about that uncertainty, about knowing that the world still contains moments of genuine mystery, even 35,000 feet above Alaska on a routine cargo flight. Imagine living through a sustained period of unexplained aerial phenomena. Not a single incident you might second-guess or rationalize away, but months of repeated sightings, witnessed by thousands of people, including trained observers, tracked by military radar, and investigated in real time by a nation's defense forces. That's what happened in Belgium between November 1989 and April 1990, in what came to be known as the Belgian UFO wave. It began in November 1989, when police officers in the town of Eupen reported seeing a large triangular craft with bright lights at each corner, moving slowly and silently across the night sky. In the days and weeks that followed, reports came flooding in from across Belgium. Over 13,000 people would eventually report seeing something unusual. The descriptions were remarkably consistent. Large triangular objects, often with lights at the corners, sometimes with a red or orange light in the center, moving in ways that didn't match conventional aircraft, hovering silently, accelerating rapidly, making sharp turns that seemed to defy the physics of flight as we understand it. What elevates the Belgian wave beyond typical UFO flap is the response it generated from official sources. Rather than dismissing the reports or remaining silent, the Belgian Air Force took them seriously. They investigated, they listened to witnesses, and on the night of March 30-31, 1990, they did something extraordinary. They scrambled F-16 fighter jets to intercept these objects. 2 F-16s were dispatched after ground radar installations detected unidentified returns that correlated with visual sightings. The jets locked onto the targets with their onboard radar systems, and what happened next is documented in the official military records. The objects, whatever they were, performed maneuvers that seemed impossible for any known aircraft. The radar showed them accelerating from roughly 150 miles per hour to over 1,000 miles per hour in seconds. descending from 10,000 feet to near ground level almost instantaneously, and executing turns that would subject any conventional aircraft, and certainly any pilot, to G-forces far beyond survivable limits. The pilots themselves never achieved visual contact with the objects. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Their radar systems were tracking something, making locks that would normally indicate a solid aircraft. But when they looked in that direction, they saw nothing. This could suggest the radar was picking up false returns, anomalies in the system, or atmospheric conditions creating ghost images. But the radar operators on the ground were seeing the same returns, and the timing corresponded with civilian reports from the ground of seeing unusual lights and craft. Major General Wilfried de Brouwer, who was Deputy Chief of the Belgian Air Force at the time, spoke openly about the incident. He confirmed that something was detected on radar, that it performed maneuvers unlike any conventional aircraft, and that after thorough investigation, they couldn't identify what it was. He was careful not to claim it was extraterrestrial, but he was equally clear that they couldn't explain it as any known aircraft, weather phenomena, or technical malfunction. The Belgian government's response to the wave was notable for its transparency. They held press conferences, shared data with civilian researchers, and refused to simply dismiss the thousands of reports they'd received. In a sense, Belgium became a test case for how a government might handle a sustained UFO phenomenon with openness rather than secrecy or ridicule. Of course, skeptical explanations have been proposed. Some researchers have suggested the triangular shape reported so consistently might have been influenced by the recent introduction of the F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter, whose triangular shape had been widely publicized. Perhaps people were seeing conventional aircraft or helicopters, and primed by the stealth fighter's distinctive silhouette, interpreting them as something more exotic. The radar returns might have been caused by atmospheric conditions. Temperature inversions can create false radar echoes, and under certain circumstances, these can appear to move in unusual ways. But these explanations struggle with certain aspects of the Belgian wave. The sheer number of witnesses, the consistency of the descriptions across different locations and times, the apparent coordination between visual sightings and radar tracking, and the involvement of trained military observers and pilots. These elements resist easy dismissal. What we're left with is a case study in how societies respond to unexplained phenomena. Belgium's openness created a wealth of documentation and a model for treating witnesses with respect rather than ridicule. The fact that we can discuss the Belgian wave with such detail is largely because the authorities treated it as worth investigating rather than worth hiding or mocking. As you drift further toward sleep, consider what it means that a modern European nation, with all its technological sophistication and military resources, could experience months of unexplained aerial phenomena involving thousands of witnesses and still arrive at no definitive explanation. Not because they didn't investigate, they did thoroughly, but because sometimes thorough investigation leads not to answers, but to more refined questions. The Belgian wave ended as mysteriously as it began, with sightings becoming less frequent through the spring of 1990 and eventually ceasing altogether. Whatever was in the skies over Belgium during those months, it left behind a detailed record, professional military analysis, and a population that shared an experience of collective wonder and uncertainty. And perhaps that's a valuable thing in itself, a reminder that the world can still surprise us, that the sky can still show us things we don't immediately understand, and that maintaining both curiosity and rigor in the face of the unknown is a worthwhile endeavor. There's something quietly revolutionary about the approach Norway has taken to a mystery that's been occurring in a remote valley for nearly a century. Rather than dismissing it, sensationalizing it, or trying to explain it away without investigation, they've simply studied it patiently, scientifically, for decades. The Hestelen Valley is a sparsely populated area in central Norway, surrounded by mountains, the kind of place where the night sky remains genuinely dark and the landscape feels ancient and unchanging. Since at least the 1930s, residents of this valley have reported seeing unexplained lights, sometimes white, sometimes yellow or red, sometimes appearing as single points, other times as elongated shapes. These lights hover, they move, they appear for minutes or even hours before vanishing. Unlike most UFO phenomena that flare up and disappear, the Hestalen lights have been remarkably persistent, returning again and again to the same general area. What makes Hestalen particularly interesting from a scientific standpoint began in 1983, when a group of Norwegian and Swedish researchers established Project Hestalen. Rather than attempting to prove or disprove any particular theory about the lights, they simply committed to observing and documenting them. They set up automated monitoring stations with cameras, radar, spectrum analyzers, and magnetometers. They collected data, they waited, and the lights kept appearing. Over the decades since, researchers have photographed the lights, captured them on video, tracked them with multiple instruments simultaneously. The lights are real. This isn't a question of misidentification or mass hallucination. Something genuinely unusual is happening in this valley, with enough regularity that scientific instruments can catch it in the act. The question isn't whether the lights exist, but what they are. The leading scientific hypothesis involves the valley's unique geology. Hestalen sits in an area with unusual mineral deposits. The rocks on one side of the valley have different electrical properties than those on the other side, creating a natural battery effect. When combined with water flowing through underground streams and specific atmospheric conditions, this could potentially generate piezoelectric effects, electricity produced by mechanical stress on certain crystals. The theory suggests that these geological batteries might produce ionized gas clouds that become luminous, perhaps through some sort of plasma formation. These plasma balls could potentially explain the light's behavior, their ability to hover, their varied colors, their apparent movement. Some researchers have even proposed that the lights might represent a type of naturally occurring ball lightning, a phenomenon that's itself not fully understood but is known to exist. It's an elegant hypothesis, grounded in real physics and geology. But it remains a hypothesis because we haven't definitively proven this is what's happening. The Hestalen lights don't appear on demand, and laboratory recreation of the proposed conditions hasn't yet produced identical phenomena. So the research continues, patient and methodical, adding to the dataset year by year. There's something deeply satisfying about this approach to mystery. No jumping to conclusions, no rush to declare the case solved, or to insist it must be something extraordinary. Just careful observation, documentation, and the scientific method applied to something genuinely anomalous. The Hessdalen project represents what we might call mature ufology, the recognition that unexplained phenomena deserve serious investigation, but that serious investigation takes time and requires resisting both the urge to dismiss and the urge to sensationalize. Perhaps what's most remarkable is how long this has continued. Nearly 4 decades of systematic study, multiple PhD dissertations completed using Hessdalen data, international cooperation between scientists from various disciplines. The lights have become a laboratory for studying atmospheric plasma, geological electricity, and the intersection of different branches of Earth science. Even if the eventual explanation turns out to be entirely prosaic, some unusual but ultimately conventional combination of natural processes, the Hessdalen project will have contributed valuable scientific knowledge. And yet, after all these years of study, the lights remain officially classified as unexplained. Not because scientists haven't formed theories, but because the scientific process requires that theories be testable and repeatable, and the Hessdalen phenomenon is proving stubbornly difficult to fully replicate or predict. The lights appear on their own schedule, following patterns we can observe, but not yet entirely understand. There's a lesson in patience here, one that feels particularly appropriate as you settle deeper into sleep. Some mysteries don't yield their secrets quickly. Some phenomena exist in that space between the explainable and the inexplicable, slowly revealing themselves through years of careful attention. The Hessdalen lights have been glowing in that Norwegian valley since before most of us were born, and they'll likely continue long after, indifferent to our attempts to categorize them, patient in their own mysterious way. What would it be like to live in Hessdalen, to have these lights as a regular feature of your environment? Not something frightening or even particularly remarkable after a while, just another aspect of the valley you call home. The lights that scientists come from around the world to study, that generate papers and hypotheses and doctoral research. They're just part of the landscape for the people who've lived there their whole lives. There's something grounding about that perspective, a reminder that mystery and normalcy can coexist quite comfortably. As you drift, imagine those lights appearing over that remote Norwegian valley tonight, just as they did last night and might tomorrow night. Imagine the automated cameras clicking on, the instruments beginning their measurements, the data being added to decades of collected observations. Imagine the researchers checking the records in the morning, noting the appearance, adding another point to the long curve of information that might eventually lead to understanding, or might not. And imagine that being okay, the investigation being valuable in itself, the wonder being worth preserving even as we work toward explanation. There are UFO cases that involve a single witness or a brief sighting, something ambiguous that leaves room for multiple interpretations. And then there are cases like Rendlesham Forest, where trained military personnel experienced something strange over the course of 2 nights, documented it in real time, conducted investigations, took measurements, and filed official reports. And we still don't have a definitive answer about what happened. The Rendlesham Forest incident took place in December 1980. in a wooded area between two Royal Air Force bases in Suffolk, England, RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge. These bases were leased to the United States Air Force and housed nuclear weapons, so they were among the most secure and carefully monitored locations in Britain. The personnel stationed there were trained observers, accustomed to identifying aircraft, and responsible for some of the most sensitive military assets in the NATO alliance. Late on December 26, 1980, security personnel saw lights descending into the forest just beyond the base perimeter. Thinking an aircraft might have crashed, they requested permission to investigate. 3 men, Staff Sergeant Jim Peniston, Airman First Class John Burroughs, and Airman First Class Edward Cabansag, went into the forest to investigate. What they reported finding wasn't wreckage from a conventional aircraft. According to Peniston's later testimony, they encountered a triangular craft, metallic in appearance, approximately 9 feet long and 6 feet high, sitting in a small clearing. He described symbols or markings on its surface and said the object felt warm to the touch and created a static electricity sensation in the air around it. Burroughs reported seeing the object move through the trees in ways that seemed to defy solid geometry, as if it could slip between the trunks without disturbing them. Both men described unusual light effects and a sense of time distortion. The incident seemed to take minutes, but hours had passed when they returned to base. The following night, Deputy Base Commander Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt led a larger investigation team back into the forest, equipped with radiation detectors, cameras, and audio recording equipment. Halt recorded his observations in real time on a handheld tape recorder, and this recording has been made public. You can listen to it yourself. The audio captures his Geiger counter clicking frantically when pointed at the supposed landing site and at certain trees in the area, measuring radiation levels significantly above background. The recording captures his surprise, his attempts to maintain professional composure while describing things that didn't fit his understanding of what should be happening in those woods. The team documented 3 depressions in the ground where the object had allegedly been, forming a triangular pattern. They took plaster casts of these indentations. They measured elevated radiation. They saw lights moving through the forest and in the sky, lights that seemed to respond to their movements, that appeared to drip something that looked like molten metal. Halt's tape recording captures all of this, along with his growing sense that they were witnessing something genuinely anomalous. In the aftermath, official reports were filed. The most well-known is Halt's memo to the British Ministry of Defense, a dry official document that nonetheless describes events that seem extraordinary: the physical traces, the radiation readings, the multiple witnesses to unusual lights and objects. The memo was classified until 1983, when it was released under the Freedom of Information Act, bringing the incident to public attention. So what actually happened in Rendlesham Forest? The explanations that have been proposed over the years are varied, and in some ways more numerous than the witnesses. Some skeptics have suggested the entire incident can be explained by the Orford Ness Lighthouse, which was visible from the forest and produced a bright rotating beam. But the military personnel involved insist they were familiar with the lighthouse, and what they saw was something else entirely, something much closer and more physically present. Others have proposed that the witnesses might have seen the re-entry of a Soviet satellite, which did occur around that time and could have created unusual light effects. But this doesn't explain the ground traces, the radiation readings, or the events of the second night. Some have suggested a combination of explanations. Perhaps the initial sighting was misidentified, and subsequent investigations were influenced by expectation and the power of suggestion, with the radiation readings being either normal variations or contamination from other sources. There's also been speculation about military exercises or tests, perhaps classified operations at the base that created unusual effects and that witnesses were never fully briefed on. The presence of nuclear weapons and the security sensitivity of the location make this a plausible consideration, though no evidence has emerged to support it, and it wouldn't easily explain all aspects of the reported events. What makes Rendlesham particularly compelling is the caliber of the witnesses and the documentation they created. These weren't civilians easily dismissed as misinterpreting ordinary events. They were military personnel responsible for nuclear security, trained in aircraft identification and threat assessment. Halt was a decorated officer with years of experience, not someone prone to flights of fancy or misidentifying the lighthouse he'd seen countless times before. The real-time audio recording provides a unique window into the investigation as it unfolded, capturing the confusion and wonder of trained observers encountering something that didn't fit their categories. Yet even with all this, the multiple witnesses, the physical evidence, the radiation readings, the official reports, we arrive at no definitive conclusion. The British Ministry of Defence investigated and concluded that the events posed no threat to national security, which was their primary concern, but they didn't attempt to definitively explain what happened. The U.S. Air Force conducted no official investigation that we know of, at least none that's been made public. Rendlesham has become one of those cases that people point to when discussing the credibility of UFO reports. If trained military observers can investigate an incident over multiple nights, document it carefully, and still leave us uncertain about what occurred, what does that tell us about the nature of these phenomena? Or about the limitations of human perception and investigation, even when conducted by professionals? As you let this story settle, consider the image of those men in the forest with their Geiger counters and cameras, the lights moving through the trees, the official recording device capturing everything for posterity. Consider the gap between documentation and explanation, between evidence and understanding. Sometimes having more information doesn't necessarily lead to more clarity. It just gives us a more detailed picture of the mystery we're trying to solve. The forest is still there, of course. Rendlesham Forest still exists, and you can walk through it if you visit Suffolk. There are even tours now, guided walks to the site where these events allegedly occurred. The trees have grown older, the bases have changed purpose, but the memory of those December nights lingers, preserved in official documents and audio recordings, in witness testimony and the continuing debates about what it all means. The forest keeps whatever secrets it holds, patient and silent, indifferent to our need for answers. In November 2004, the U.S. Navy carrier Strike Group 11 was conducting training exercises off the coast of San Diego, California. It was a routine operation, the kind of thing that happens regularly as the Navy maintains readiness and trains its personnel. the USS Nimitz carrier group had some of the most advanced radar and detection systems available. Operated by experienced personnel accustomed to monitoring the airspace and sea around them. Nothing about the exercise suggested it would become one of the most well-documented and widely discussed UFO encounters in modern history. For several days, the Princeton, a Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser, had been tracking unusual objects on its radar systems. These weren't conventional aircraft. They appeared to be descending from altitudes above 80,000 feet, which is well above the ceiling for most aircraft, down to sea level in a matter of seconds. Then they would hover or ascend again, just as rapidly. The radar operators were puzzled, but assumed there must be some explanation, perhaps a software glitch or some classified military test they weren't aware of. On November 14th, the decision was made to investigate more directly. 2 FA-18 Super Hornets were launched from the Nimitz, piloted by Commander David Fravor and Lieutenant Commander Jim Slate, with their respective weapons system officers in the back seats. They were vectored toward the location where the Princeton's radar was showing one of these anomalous returns. What happened next was witnessed by 4 trained military aviators and recorded by multiple sensor systems. As they approached the location, about 20 miles from the ship, the pilots saw something unusual on the ocean surface. A large area of roiling water, as if something large was just beneath the surface. And above this disturbance, approximately 50 feet above the water, they saw an object. Commander Fravor described it as a white craft, about 40 feet long, shaped like a tic-tac breath mint, oblong with no visible wings, tail, rotors, or exhaust plume. No means of propulsion that he could identify. It was moving erratically above the water, like a ping-pong ball bouncing against a wall, making rapid movements without any apparent acceleration or deceleration. Fravor decided to investigate more closely. As he descended toward the object in his FA-18, something remarkable happened. The object seemed to respond to his approach. It began to mirror his movements, ascending as he descended. Then suddenly it accelerated and disappeared. Not flew away. Fravor was emphatic about this distinction. It didn't go supersonic and break the sound barrier, which would have created a sonic boom. It simply vanished from sight, moving from hovering near the ocean surface to gone so quickly that he couldn't track it. Simultaneously, the radar operators on the Princeton watched the object accelerate from the location where the pilots had encountered it to the carrier group's predetermined rendezvous point, a location that was part of the classified mission planning and shouldn't have been known to anyone outside the operation. The object covered approximately 60 miles in less than a minute, appearing at the exact location the pilots had planned to regroup. Then it disappeared from radar entirely. But the encounter wasn't over. A second flight of FA-18s was launched, and one of these aircraft had its forward-looking infrared FLAR camera system activated. This system recorded what's now known as the FLIR-1 video or the Nimitz video, infrared footage of an object moving in unusual ways, with the pilots' voices audible as they track it and express their confusion about what they're seeing. One pilot's voice can be heard saying, "Look at that thing, dude. It's rotating." The video shows the object suddenly accelerating out of frame at a speed that made tracking impossible. This footage, along with 2 other videos from separate incidents in 2015, was officially released by the U.S. Department of Defense in 2020, confirming its authenticity and the fact that these were indeed officially documented encounters with unidentified aerial phenomena. Now, let's sit with what makes this case particularly significant. This wasn't a solitary witness seeing lights in the sky. This was multiple trained observers, some of the most skilled pilots in the world, flying some of the most advanced aircraft in existence, witnessing something strange. The encounter was captured on multiple sensor systems: radar, infrared, the pilot's own targeting systems. There's video. There's official documentation. The Navy has confirmed these events occurred and that the objects remain unidentified. The performance characteristics of the object defy our current understanding of aerodynamics and propulsion. To accelerate from a standstill to the speeds observed without any visible means of propulsion, without creating sonic booms, to change direction instantaneously without any apparent concern for G-forces. These are capabilities that would revolutionize aerospace engineering if we could replicate them. Various explanations have been proposed, of course. Some skeptics have suggested the infrared video might show a distant aircraft being tracked at an angle that makes its movement appear more unusual than it was. Others have proposed that some kind of atmospheric effect or sensor artifacts might account for what was seen. But these explanations struggle to account for all aspects of the encounter: the visual observations by the pilots, the radar tracking from multiple systems, the apparent responsiveness of the object to the pilot's actions, and most significantly, the performance characteristics that seem to violate basic physics as we understand it. In 2020, following the official release of these videos and increased public interest, the U.S. Navy established new guidelines for how pilots should report encounters with unidentified aerial phenomena, and the Pentagon established the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force to investigate these incidents. The very existence of this task force represents a significant shift in how the military approaches these reports, treating them not as fodder for ridicule, but as potential national security concerns that deserve serious investigation. Commander Fravor, who has spoken publicly about his experience, has been clear about what he knows and what he doesn't. He knows what he saw. He knows it performed in ways that didn't match any aircraft he was familiar with. And after decades as a naval aviator, he was familiar with pretty much everything that flies. But he's also careful not to claim it was extraterrestrial or to jump to conclusions about its origin. He simply maintains that it was something genuinely anomalous, something that deserves investigation and explanation. The Nimitz encounter represents perhaps the strongest case we have for unidentified aerial phenomena that display extraordinary capabilities. It has multiple credible witnesses, multiple forms of technical documentation, and official acknowledgement from the military. It's neither easily dismissed nor easily explained, and it's led to a broader conversation about these phenomena that involves scientists, military officials, and policymakers in ways that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. As you consider this account in the peaceful state before sleep, perhaps what's most striking is the gap it reveals. We have extraordinary technology, radar systems that can track objects across vast distances, infrared cameras that can see in complete darkness, aircraft capable of supersonic flight, and incredible maneuverability. And yet, with all this technology, operated by some of the most highly trained personnel in the world, we encountered something that we couldn't identify, couldn't catch, and still can't fully explain. That's a humbling thought, but maybe also an exciting one. The sky, it seems, still has secrets that even our most sophisticated sensors can't quite penetrate. There's something particularly affecting about accounts from children. They haven't yet learned all the reasons why certain things are supposed to be impossible, haven't developed the careful skepticism that adults bring to unusual experiences. This can make their testimony suspect in some ways. Children are imaginative, suggestible, prone to fantasy, but it can also make their accounts oddly compelling, especially when those accounts are consistent, detailed, and delivered with the kind of sincerity that's hard to fake. On September 16, 1994, at the Aerial School in Ruwa, Zimbabwe, something unusual happened during morning recess. 62 children, ranging in age from about 6 to 12 years old, were playing on the school grounds when, according to their subsequent reports, they saw a silver craft descend from the sky and land in a rough area just beyond the school property line, a section of brush and small trees that was technically off-limits to students. What makes this case remarkable isn't just the number of witnesses, though that's certainly significant. It's the consistency of their accounts, the detail they provided, and the emotional impact the experience seemed to have on them. The children described beings emerging from the craft, figures with large eyes and very thin bodies, dressed in tight-fitting dark suits. According to many of the children, these beings communicated with them, though not through speech. Several children reported receiving messages or images telepathically, messages that seemed to be about environmental destruction, about humans harming the earth, about a future where technology had damaged the natural world beyond repair. The teachers didn't witness the event themselves. They were inside during recess, but they certainly witnessed the aftermath. The children came running back to the school buildings in an unusual state. Some excited, some frightened, many trying to tell the teachers what they'd just seen. The level of agitation was high enough that the headmaster, Colin Mackey, took the reports seriously and allowed the children to draw pictures and write accounts of what they'd experienced. These drawings and written statements are fascinating documents. They show remarkable consistency in the basic elements: the craft, the beings, their large eyes, their thin bodies. The drawings look like what you might expect from children of different ages and artistic abilities, all trying to depict something unusual they'd seen. Not identical, but thematically consistent in ways that suggest they were drawing from a shared experience, rather than copying each other or responding to leading questions. Within days of the incident, Dr. John Mack arrived to investigate. Mack was a Harvard psychiatrist, a Pulitzer Prize winner, and someone with an unusual interest in UFO encounters and alien contact experiences. His presence brought significant attention to the Aerial School incident, and he conducted detailed interviews with many of the children, both individually and in small groups. These interviews, some of which were filmed, are remarkable to watch. The children speak with the kind of straightforward sincerity that's characteristic of truthful accounts. They don't elaborate unnecessarily or try to make their stories more dramatic. They describe what they saw in the matter-of-fact way that children often describe experiences. This happened, then that happened, and it made me feel this way. When asked leading questions or when Mac would try to suggest interpretations, many of the children would gently correct him or clarify their own experience. Several of the children were visibly emotional when describing the messages they said they'd received. They talked about feeling worried for the earth, about being shown images of environmental devastation, about being left with the sense that humans needed to change how we treat the planet. These weren't abstract concerns for children living in rural Zimbabwe in the mid-1990s. These were immediate, emotional responses to something they felt they'd been shown or told. Dr. Mack, conducting these interviews with appropriate skeptical methodology, looked for signs of collusion or coaching. He separated children and asked them the same questions, looking for variations that might suggest they were telling rehearsed stories. He interviewed children of different ages and social groups within the school. He spoke with teachers and parents. His conclusion, published in his later work, was that these children genuinely believed they had experienced something unusual, and that their accounts showed no evidence of fabrication or collaboration. Now, how do we make sense of this case? The explanations that have been proposed over the years vary widely. Some skeptics suggest it was a case of mass hysteria or social contagion. One child misidentified something, perhaps a local person in unusual clothing or some mundane occurrence, and this misidentification spread rapidly through the excited group of children, growing in the telling until it became something extraordinary. Others have proposed that it might have been a prank or publicity stunt somehow orchestrated by someone at or near the school, though no evidence has emerged to support this. And it would require a level of sophistication and coordination that seems implausible given the circumstances. Some researchers have noted that the children's descriptions of environmental messages align suspiciously well with broader cultural concerns about environmental destruction that were prominent in the 1990s. Perhaps, they suggest, the children were unconsciously incorporating these concerns into their interpretation of an ambiguous experience, or even confabulating the entire event based on environmental themes they'd been exposed to through media and education. But these explanations face challenges. The sheer number of consistent witnesses is difficult to dismiss. The immediate and emotional nature of the children's responses, before they'd had time to discuss and align their stories, suggests something genuinely unusual occurred. The drawings and written accounts created within hours of the event, before outside influence or media attention could shape the narrative, show that consistency from the very beginning. Perhaps most compellingly, many of these children, now adults, have stood by their accounts decades later. In follow-up interviews conducted in recent years, many of them maintain that what they experienced was real, that they genuinely encountered something that day that they still don't fully understand. The passage of time and adult perspective hasn't led them to recant or reinterpret their childhood experience as fantasy or misidentification. What are we to make of this? The Ariel School incident sits in a particularly uncomfortable space for rational analysis. It's too well documented and consistent to dismiss easily, yet the details, telepathic communication, environmental messages, beings from craft, strain credulity from a scientific standpoint. It's a case that seems to demand either acceptance of something extraordinary or a level of skeptical explanation that feels inadequate to account for all the details. Perhaps what's most valuable about the Ariel School case isn't determining definitively what happened, but reflecting on what it means that something clearly happened. That 62 children had an experience that affected them deeply enough that they're still talking about it decades later. That their teachers and parents took seriously enough to document and investigate, and that we still don't have a fully satisfying explanation for. As sleep draws closer, let yourself sit with that uncertainty. Imagine being one of those children, experiencing something you don't have the framework to understand, trying to put it into words and pictures, knowing it was real to you, but not having the language to make others fully grasp it. Or imagine being one of the teachers, watching dozens of your students return from recess visibly shaken and all telling variations of the same strange story. The truth of what happened in Rua, Zimbabwe that September morning remains elusive, but the impact it had on those children, on the investigators who studied it, on all of us considering it now, that impact is undeniable. There's something particularly poignant about a UFO encounter witnessed primarily by children and teenagers, especially when those young witnesses grow into adults who still maintain their accounts decades later, still insist that what they saw was real, and still carry the memory with a clarity that time hasn't dimmed. The Westall UFO incident of 1966 is one of those cases, an event that occurred in broad daylight, witnessed by hundreds of people, and yet somehow slipped through the cracks of official investigation and public awareness for decades. On April 6, 1966, at Westall High School in Melbourne, Australia, it was a normal autumn day. Classes were in session. Students were going about their usual routines, and nothing suggested that the day would become a defining moment in the lives of many people present. Then, around 11 a.m., something appeared in the sky. Approximately 200 students and several teachers watched as a silvery, disc-shaped object descended from the sky and appeared to land or hover very close to the ground in an area of open land called the Grange, adjacent to the school grounds. The object was described consistently by witnesses as metallic, silent, and larger than a car. It seemed to settle into a patch of long grass near a grove of pine trees, staying there long enough for students to get a good look at it, long enough for some to start running toward it to investigate more closely. Then, according to numerous witnesses, the object rose rapidly back into the sky and departed at high speed. Some witnesses reported seeing what appeared to be 5 aircraft, small planes, following or pursuing the object as it left. The object outpaced these aircraft easily, disappearing from view while the conventional planes were still visible, still presumably trying to follow. The students who had run closest to the landing site reported finding a circular area in the grass that looked flattened or disturbed, and some noticed what they described as a strange smell in the air, though accounts of this vary. Several students and at least one teacher reached the site and examined it, though they were quickly told to leave the area. Here's where the story becomes even more intriguing. Within hours of the incident, according to multiple witnesses, military personnel and official vehicles arrived at the scene. The area where the object had apparently landed was cordoned off. Witnesses report seeing men in military or official-looking uniforms examining the site, taking measurements, perhaps taking samples, though from a distance it was hard to tell exactly what they were doing. At the school, something equally unusual happened. The headmaster held an assembly and reportedly instructed students not to talk about what they'd seen. Some students remember being told explicitly that they shouldn't discuss the incident, that it would be better for everyone if they kept quiet about it. Several witnesses have said that they or their families were visited by men who identified themselves as officials. Whether military or government wasn't entirely clear, who asked questions about what had been seen, and according to some accounts, suggested that speaking publicly about the incident wouldn't be wise. Teachers who witnessed the event were reportedly instructed not to discuss it. One science teacher, Andrew Greenwood, had apparently taken photographs of the object, but these photographs disappeared and have never surfaced publicly. Greenwood himself refused to discuss the incident for decades afterward, and when he finally did speak about it before his death, he confirmed that he'd seen something unusual but remained reticent about the details. The local newspaper ran a brief story about the incident, but it received minimal coverage at the time, and the story quickly faded from public attention. For years, the Westall incident was known primarily to those who had witnessed it, a shared memory among a generation of Melbourne students and teachers, but not part of the broader UFO narrative. Then, in the 2000s, researchers began systematically interviewing the now adult witnesses. What they found was remarkable. Decades later, the witnesses still remembered the event clearly, still described it in consistent terms, and many still felt confused and somewhat disturbed by the official response that had followed. The witnesses described feeling dismissed, told that what they'd clearly seen with their own eyes wasn't important or wasn't what they thought it was. These interviews have been collected in documentaries and written accounts, and they present a compelling picture. These are professional adults, teachers, engineers, business people, describing an event from their youth with the kind of specific detail that suggests genuine memory rather than confabulation. They don't agree on every detail, which actually lends credibility to their accounts. Genuine witnesses rarely have perfect agreement because perception varies. Attention focuses on different aspects, and memory is selective. But the core elements remain consistent. A metallic disc descending into the Grange, staying long enough to be observed clearly, then departing rapidly. Several witnesses have expressed frustration that the incident wasn't properly investigated or documented at the time, that their experiences were essentially dismissed or suppressed, that they were told to forget something that was clearly significant in their lives. Some describe feeling gaslit, being told that what they'd witnessed with hundreds of others wasn't real or wasn't important, being made to doubt their own perceptions. The Australian government has no official record of investigating the Westall incident, though the presence of what multiple witnesses describe as military or official personnel at the scene suggests someone took it seriously enough to respond. Files that might contain information about the incident, if they exist, haven't been released or acknowledged. It's possible they were destroyed, or that they remain classified for reasons that aren't clear, or that no official documentation was ever created despite the official presence at the scene. Skeptical explanations for Westall have been proposed. Some have suggested it might have been an experimental aircraft or balloon test, perhaps something classified at the time. The highball program, High Altitude Balloon, was conducting tests in Australia around that time, and some researchers have suggested one of these balloons might account for what was seen. But the witnesses reject this explanation, noting that what they saw was metallic and disc-shaped, nothing like a balloon, and that it moved in ways balloons don't move, especially the rapid departure that witnesses describe. Others have suggested it might have been some kind of atmospheric phenomenon misidentified by excited students, with the event growing in the retelling. But this struggles to account for the adult witnesses, teachers who were trained observers and not prone to mass hysteria, or for the official response that followed, which seems disproportionate if nothing unusual actually occurred. What we're left with is a well-witnessed event that was apparently significant enough to prompt an official response, but which has no official acknowledgement or explanation. Hundreds of people, including responsible adults, watched something unusual happen in broad daylight, and then watched as the area was cordoned off and they were told not to discuss what they'd seen. That sequence of events is itself fascinating, regardless of what the object actually was. The Westall witnesses, those who've spoken publicly in recent years, often express a mixture of emotions about the incident. There's pride in having witnessed something extraordinary, frustration at being told to stay silent about it, confusion about why it wasn't investigated more thoroughly, and a lingering sense of validation when they connect with other witnesses and realize their memories align. Many describe it as a formative experience, something that taught them that sometimes you see things that don't fit the official narrative, and that sometimes authorities don't want you to talk about those things. As you drift further towards sleep, imagine being a teenager watching something impossible descend from the sky during a normal school day. Imagine running toward it with your classmates, driven by curiosity and wonder. Imagine then being told by adults that you shouldn't talk about what you clearly saw, that it's better to forget, to stay quiet. And imagine carrying that memory for decades, that mixture of certainty about your own experience and uncertainty about what it means, about why it was treated the way it was. The Grange still exists, though the area has changed over the decades. You can visit the site if you travel to Melbourne, can stand where those students stood, can look up at the same sky they were watching that autumn day in 1966. The pine trees might be older or different. The grass certainly grows and is cut in its regular cycles, and the schoolyard nearby continues to fill with students who probably don't know the story of what happened there. But for those who witnessed it, the Westall incident remains vivid. A moment when something unexplained interrupted the ordinary world and then vanished, leaving only memories and questions behind. There are UFO sightings that are witnessed by a handful of people, maybe a dozen, maybe even 100, if circumstances align. And then there's the Phoenix Lights, an event witnessed by thousands of people across hundreds of miles, documented by countless photographs and videos, involving credible witnesses from all walks of life, and yet still remaining officially unexplained more than 2 decades later. On the evening of March 13th, 1997, something unusual appeared in the skies over Arizona, Nevada, and the Mexican state of Sonora. The phenomenon actually consisted of two separate events, though they're often conflated in public memory. The first was a massive V-shaped formation of lights that traveled southward from Nevada through Arizona, witnessed by hundreds of people along its path. The second was a series of stationary lights that appeared over Phoenix later that evening, seen by thousands of residents and captured in numerous videos. Let's start with the V formation, because this is perhaps the more mysterious of the two events. Beginning around 7:30 p.m., witnesses in Henderson, Nevada reported seeing a large V-shaped object or formation in the sky, massive in scale. Some described it as being larger than a football field. Others said it was enormous beyond easy estimation. This formation traveled south, passing over Prescott Valley, then Prescott, then Phoenix, maintaining a relatively slow, steady pace. The witnesses who saw this formation up close, and by up close, we mean relatively low altitude, clearly visible against the night sky, described it in remarkably consistent terms. They saw a V-shaped arrangement of lights, often described as amber or orange-white in color, moving silently or with minimal sound across the sky. Many witnesses insisted it wasn't separate lights, but rather lights on a single massive structure. They reported seeing the stars being blocked out as the object passed, suggesting a solid form behind the lights. Dr. Lynn Kaite, a physician living in Phoenix, had an unusual relationship with the Phoenix lights. She'd actually witnessed similar lights on several occasions before March 13, 1997. On this night, she managed to photograph and videotape the phenomena from her home, and she would later become one of the primary documentarians and advocates for serious investigation of the event. Her footage shows lights maintaining formation and moving in coordination, behavior that doesn't immediately suggest separate aircraft or disconnected sources. The sheer scale of the V formation is difficult to convey. Witnesses described it as spanning much of the visible sky when it passed overhead. If it was a single object, as many witnesses insist, it would have been extraordinarily large, larger than any known aircraft. If it was separate objects maintaining formation, the precision and silence of that formation was itself unusual. Multiple witnesses, including pilots and people with aviation experience, stated that what they saw didn't match any known aircraft configuration or behavior. As the formation continued south, it passed over Phoenix proper around 8:30 p.m. By this time, hundreds of people were watching, many calling news stations and emergency services to report what they were seeing. The formation continued south until it passed out of view toward Tucson and possibly into Mexico. Then came the second event, the one that would be captured on the most video footage and photographs. Between roughly 10 p.m. and 10:30 p.m., a series of lights appeared in the sky over Phoenix, seemingly stationary, hanging in a line or arc pattern. These lights were seen by thousands of people. It was a clear night, and the lights were bright enough to be visible across the metropolitan area. People came out of their homes, stood in streets, gathered on rooftops to watch and photograph what they were seeing. These stationary lights hung in the sky for several minutes before slowly disappearing, winking out one by one. Hundreds of videos and photographs were taken, many of which have been analyzed extensively. The lights appear as bright amber or orange points, maintaining their positions relative to each other, then fading away sequentially. The official explanation for these later lights came from the U.S. Air Force several months after the event. They claimed the lights were flares dropped by A-10 Warthog aircraft from the 104th Fighter Squadron, Maryland Air National Guard, during a training exercise at the Berry Goldwater Range, southwest of Phoenix. Flares, they explained, can hang in the sky on small parachutes and can appear stationary from a distance, and the timing matched training exercises that night. This explanation has satisfied some people, but many witnesses remain unconvinced. The lights appeared to be at the wrong angle and distance for flares dropped over the Goldwater Range. Flares typically burn out quickly and drift as they descend, but these lights appeared stable and long-lasting. Some witnesses closer to the phenomena reported that the lights didn't look like flares, but like solid sources of illumination. And most significantly, this explanation doesn't address the earlier V formation at all, the massive object or formation that traveled from Nevada through Arizona hours before the stationary lights appeared. The response of Arizona officials to the Phoenix lights was, in some ways, as interesting as the event itself. Frances Barwood, a Phoenix City Council woman, began investigating the incident after being contacted by constituents. She asked questions, sought official explanations, and expressed concern that something witnessed by so many people wasn't being taken seriously. For her efforts, she was largely dismissed and even ridiculed by some officials and media outlets. The governor of Arizona at the time, Fife Symington, held a press conference about the incident that became famous for the wrong reasons. He brought out a staff member dressed in an alien costume as a joke, making light of the concerns residents had expressed. The press conference was clearly intended to diffuse anxiety and perhaps discourage further inquiry. However, years later, after leaving office, Symington revealed that he himself had witnessed the V formation that night and had been impressed by what he saw. He'd seen something large and unexplained, he said, but felt that, as governor, he needed to project calm and avoid panic. Hence the joking press conference. His later admission added a strange coda to the official response. Even the governor, who publicly mocked the incident, privately found it significant. The Phoenix lights remain one of the most witnessed UFO events in history. The sheer number of observers, the video and photographic documentation, the involvement of credible witnesses including pilots, police officers, and even eventually the governor. All of this makes it difficult to dismiss as mass hysteria or misidentification by uninformed witnesses. Yet we're left without a completely satisfying explanation. The later stationary lights might well have been flares, though many witnesses dispute this. The earlier V formation remains essentially unexplained. If it was conventional aircraft, what formation of known aircraft matches witness descriptions and behaves in the manner reported? If it was something else, what was it, and why has no official documentation of it been released? What the Phoenix lights really represent is the challenge of collective witness experience. When thousands of people see something unusual, when they photograph and document it, when they call authorities and media to report it, how should society respond? With serious investigation, with explanation, even if that explanation doesn't fully account for all observations, with dismissal or ridicule. The Phoenix Lights tested these questions, and the responses varied from genuine inquiry to jokes at press conferences. As you settle deeper into rest, imagine what it would be like to be one of those thousands of witnesses. You're going about your evening, perhaps taking out trash or walking your dog, and you look up to see something enormous and unexplained moving silently across the sky. Your neighbors are seeing it too, pointing and watching. You grab a camera, try to capture what you're seeing, and then, in the days that follow, you watch as what you clearly witnessed is explained away, or joked about, or simply not taken seriously, despite thousands of others having seen the exact same thing. The Phoenix Lights event ended as these events do, with the lights disappearing and the night returning to normal. The stars that had been briefly accompanied by these unusual lights continued their ancient patterns, indifferent to the confusion below. The desert sky over Arizona returned to its familiar darkness, and life continued. But for those thousands of witnesses, March 13th, 1997 remains a date marked in memory. The night the sky held something unexplained, and the night they joined thousands of others in watching it, wondering about it, and finding that certainty about what you've seen doesn't always lead to certainty about what it means. There's something almost absurd about a UFO appearing over one of the busiest airports in the world, in broad daylight, witnessed by multiple airline employees and pilots, and yet having no official investigation. But that's exactly what happened at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport on November 7th, 2006, in an incident that remained unknown to the public until a journalist at the Chicago Tribune received a tip and decided to investigate. It was around 4:15 p.m. on a gray November afternoon. United Airlines Flight 446 was preparing to depart from Gate C-17, bound for North Carolina. The airport was operating normally. Thousands of passengers moving through terminals, aircraft taxiing, taking off, landing. The complex choreography of one of the world's busiest aviation hubs continuing as it does every day. Then several United Airlines employees, both on the ground and in the airport tower, noticed something unusual above Gate C-17. A dark, disc-shaped object was hovering silently in the overcast sky, apparently positioned directly above the terminal. It wasn't moving with the cloud layer, wasn't drifting or being carried by wind. It was simply there, stationary, clearly visible against the gray clouds. The witnesses included mechanics, pilots, supervisors, ramp workers, people who spent their professional lives around aircraft, who were accustomed to seeing every type of plane from every angle, in every kind of weather. These weren't people likely to misidentify a helicopter or conventional aircraft, and what they were seeing didn't match anything in their extensive experience. The object was described consistently by witnesses as a dark gray or metallic disc, roughly 20 to 40 feet in diameter, smaller than a commercial aircraft, but still quite substantial. It had no visible means of propulsion, no wings, no rotors, no exhaust. It made no sound that anyone could detect, which was particularly notable given the ambient noise level at an active airport. It simply hovered, dark and distinct against the lighter clouds above. Multiple witnesses watched this object for several minutes. Some estimate it was visible for 5 minutes. Others say it might have been as long as 15 minutes. Time perception being notoriously unreliable during unusual events. People were pointing at it, discussing it, some grabbing binoculars or telephoto lenses to get a better look. A few tried to photograph it, though the images that were taken are inconclusive. The object appears as a dark spot against gray sky, difficult to distinguish in still images from various ordinary objects or artifacts. Then, according to multiple witnesses, something remarkable happened. The object suddenly shot straight up through the cloud layer at extremely high speed. And as it did so, it apparently left a clear, circular hole in the clouds, a perfect break in the overcast through which blue sky was visible. This hole remained visible for several minutes after the object had disappeared, gradually filling in as the cloud layer shifted and reformed. The cloud hole detail is particularly interesting because multiple independent witnesses reported it, including some who hadn't seen the object itself but noticed the unusual formation in the clouds and wondered what had caused it. From a meteorological standpoint, creating such a hole would require rapidly displacing a significant amount of cloud moisture, suggesting tremendous speed and energy. Now here's where the story becomes almost comical in its bureaucratic absurdity. The United Airlines employees who witnessed this reported it through their internal channels. United Airlines has procedures for unusual sightings, and these procedures were followed. But the Federal Aviation Administration, when contacted about the incident, stated that they had no record of anything unusual at O'Hare that afternoon. They hadn't tracked anything on radar, hadn't received any reports from air traffic controllers, and as far as they were concerned, nothing happened. The FAA's position was essentially that since the object hadn't appeared on radar and hadn't interfered with airport operations, there was nothing to investigate. They classified it as a weather phenomenon, without actually investigating what kind of weather phenomenon might create a disc-shaped object that hovers and then shoots through clouds, leaving a hole behind. United Airlines, for their part, didn't want to make a big deal of the incident. They confirmed that employees had reported seeing something, but they didn't launch any formal investigation or make any public statements. This is perhaps understandable from a corporate perspective. Airlines generally prefer not to be associated with UFO stories, as it might undermine public confidence or invite mockery. The incident might have remained an internal United Airlines oddity, if not for John Hilkovich, a transportation reporter for the Chicago Tribune. In January 2007, 2 months after the sighting, he received a tip about the incident from someone familiar with what had happened. He began investigating, interviewing witnesses, filing Freedom of Information Act requests for any official documentation. And in January 2007, he published a detailed article about the O'Hare UFO. The article made national and international news. Here was a UFO sighting at one of the world's busiest airports, witnessed by multiple credible aviation professionals, and neither the FAA nor the airline had properly investigated it. The story highlighted the disconnect between what witnesses reported and how authorities responded, or rather, didn't respond. Following the publication, the FAA maintained its position. They released a brief statement suggesting the witnesses had likely seen a hole-punch cloud, or weather phenomenon, though they didn't explain how such a phenomenon would appear as a hovering disk before creating the hole, or why it would be visible at such low altitude over an airport terminal. From a skeptical perspective, several explanations have been proposed. The most generous to the FAA's weather phenomenon claim suggests that witnesses might have seen a lenticular cloud formation or some unusual atmospheric effect that created the illusion of a solid object. The cloud hole might have been a fall streak or virga, phenomena where precipitation falls from clouds and evaporates, sometimes creating holes or gaps in cloud layers. But these explanations struggle with several aspects of the witnesses' accounts. Lenticular clouds and similar formations don't typically hover stationary at low altitudes over airports. They don't move suddenly at high speed. And the witnesses, again, aviation professionals accustomed to seeing weather phenomena, were clear that what they saw appeared to be a solid, structured object, not a cloud formation or atmospheric effect. Others have suggested it might have been some kind of small helicopter or drone, though this doesn't account for the lack of sound, the hover time, the sudden vertical departure, or the radar invisibility. Commercial drones in 2006 weren't capable of the performance described, and any helicopter hovering over a busy airport would certainly have been noticed by air traffic control and would have appeared on radar. What we're left with is a peculiar situation. Multiple credible witnesses seeing something unusual, reporting it through proper channels, and then having their experience essentially dismissed without serious investigation. The witnesses themselves expressed frustration with this response. They'd seen something that didn't fit their understanding of aviation and weather phenomena, had reported it as they were supposed to, and had received essentially no meaningful response from the authorities tasked with air safety. The O'Hare incident raises interesting questions about institutional blindness. How does an organization respond when something occurs that doesn't fit established categories? The FAA's procedures and radar systems are designed to track aircraft that follow certain parameters. If something doesn't show up on radar but is clearly visible to witnesses, does it exist from an institutional perspective? The answer at O'Hare seemed to be no. If it's not on radar and doesn't pose an immediate safety threat, it's not worth investigating, regardless of how many credible witnesses report it. As you drift toward sleep, consider the strangeness of this. Something unusual appears over one of the busiest, most monitored, most security-conscious locations in the world. A major international airport is witnessed by multiple trained observers, and yet generates no real investigation, no serious effort to determine what was seen. It's as if the machinery of officialdom simply has no gear that engages with certain types of events, no process that activates, no curiosity that's triggered. The event occurs, is reported, is filed away, and life continues as if nothing happened. The gate at O'Hare continues to serve flights daily. Aircraft continue to taxi past that spot, passengers continue to board through that terminal, and the sky above continues to host the normal traffic of one of the world's busiest airports. For the witnesses, though, November 7, 2006 remains distinct. A day when something unexplained appeared in their workplace, challenged their understanding of what's possible, and then disappeared, leaving them with a story that many people would rather not take seriously. The object, whatever it was, departed through that cloud hole and vanished into the afternoon sky, leaving questions but few answers, and a perfect illustration of the gap between seeing something and having that seeing acknowledged as meaningful. Sometimes a UFO case becomes famous for the strangeness of the sightings themselves. Other times, what makes a case remarkable is the official response, the way authorities engaged with an ongoing series of unusual events. The Colares UFO flap of 1977 in Brazil is notable for both bizarre and frightening encounters reported by numerous witnesses, and an extraordinary months-long official military investigation that took the reports seriously. Colares is a small municipality on an island in the Amazon Delta region of Brazil, a place where rivers meet the Atlantic, where dense jungle gives way to water, where communities live in relative isolation from Brazil's major urban centers. In 1977, the population was small, primarily involved in fishing and agriculture, living a rhythm of life that had changed little over generations. This was not a place primed for mass hysteria or particularly influenced by UFO culture. Most residents had limited access to media, and their concerns were more immediate: fishing, farming, family. But in the months between September and December 1977, something unusual began happening in Colares and the surrounding communities. Residents started reporting strange lights appearing in the sky at night, lights that didn't behave like stars or aircraft. These lights would approach homes, hover over buildings, shine beams toward people and houses. And then reports began of something even more disturbing: people being struck by beams of light from these objects, beams that caused physical symptoms. Multiple residents reported being hit by these beams and suffering effects including burns, puncture marks, numbness, weakness, dizziness, and in some cases more severe symptoms requiring medical attention. Some reported feeling paralyzed when caught in the beams. Others described a sensation of heat or of being drained of energy. The local medical facilities began treating people with unusual marks and symptoms they couldn't readily explain. The fear in the community grew significant enough that people changed their behavior. Some families would take turns staying awake at night to watch for the lights and wake others if objects approached. Fishermen, who typically worked at night, became reluctant to go out on the water. People spoke of the chupa chupa, a name that roughly translates to sucker or vampire, suggesting the lights were somehow draining energy or blood from their victims. The situation became serious enough that the Brazilian Air Force decided to investigate. In October 1977, they sent Captain Urangue Holanda to Colares to lead what would become known as Operation Saucer. What makes this remarkable is that the Air Force took the report seriously enough to commit significant resources to investigation. Captain Holanda and his team spent months in the region, interviewing witnesses, collecting evidence, photographing objects in the night sky, and documenting the ongoing phenomena. Captain Holanda's team managed to photograph luminous objects in the sky over Colares on multiple occasions. These photographs show lights, sometimes multiple lights in formation, sometimes single bright objects. The team documented testimony from dozens of witnesses. They investigated the physical effects people were reporting, working with local medical personnel to examine patients. They took the operation seriously, approaching it as they would any military investigation of unknown activity in Brazilian territory. The team's reports described objects that displayed intelligent behavior, approaching and retreating, responding to light signals, appearing to observe houses and people. They documented lights that would divide into multiple objects, change color, accelerate rapidly, and perform maneuvers that didn't match conventional aircraft. Captain Holanda's reports were detailed and methodical, treating the phenomena as a genuine unknown worthy of thorough documentation. After several months, the frequency of incidents began to decrease, and eventually Operation Saucer concluded. The Air Force classified the files from the investigation. Captain Hollanda was instructed not to discuss what had been observed and documented. For nearly 2 decades, Operation Saucer remained a classified military investigation, known to few people outside official channels. Then, in 1997, Captain Hollanda gave a series of interviews to Brazilian UFO researchers, revealing details about Operation Saucer for the first time publicly. He described what his team had witnessed and documented, confirmed that they'd photographed objects they couldn't identify, and discussed the physical effects reported by witnesses. He seemed genuinely moved by some of what he'd encountered, particularly the fear and suffering of the Colares residents. Tragically, Captain Hollanda died shortly after these interviews, in circumstances officially ruled suicide, though some have questioned this determination. His death added another layer of mystery and controversy to the already complex case. Some suspected he'd been killed for revealing classified information, though there's no evidence to support this, and it's just as likely, perhaps more likely, that personal factors unrelated to UFOs were involved. In 2009, the Brazilian government released some of the Operation Saucer files, declassifying hundreds of pages of documents and photographs. These confirmed what Captain Hollanda had described: a serious, multi-month military investigation of unusual phenomena in Colares, complete with witness testimony, medical reports, and photographs of lights in the sky. From a skeptical perspective, various explanations for the Colares flap have been proposed. The region's isolation and limited access to medical care might have led to misattribution of ordinary illnesses or injuries to the mysterious lights. The Amazon has various natural phenomena: unusual electrical effects during certain weather conditions, bioluminescent organisms, methane releases from swamps that can ignite, that might account for some of the lights. The beam effects might have been psychological, physical symptoms arising from fear and stress rather than from actual contact with anything unusual. But these explanations struggle with certain aspects of the case. The photographs do show lights, though their nature isn't definitively established from the images alone. The physical symptoms, examined by medical professionals, were real, even if their cause is disputed. The Air Force investigation, lasting months and involving trained observers, lends a weight to the case that's difficult to dismiss entirely. And the consistency of reports across a dispersed population of witnesses who had limited contact with each other suggests something genuinely occurred, even if its nature remains uncertain. What makes Colares particularly interesting is less about proving what the phenomena were, and more about how they were treated. Here was a government taking citizen reports seriously enough to investigate extensively, to document thoroughly, and then, puzzlingly, to classify those findings for decades. The pattern suggests that something occurred that authorities found worth investigating, but also worth keeping quiet about, at least for a time. The people of Colares lived through months of fear and uncertainty, experiencing something their traditional knowledge and limited modern education couldn't explain. The Chupa Chupa became part of local folklore, a period remembered by those who lived through it as genuinely frightening and disruptive. For the investigators, it represented one of those rare cases where an official body engaged seriously with UFO phenomena, treated witnesses with respect, and attempted to document and understand what was occurring. As sleep draws nearer, imagine living in a small, isolated community and having your normal life disrupted by something you can't understand or control. Imagine lights appearing night after night, people in your community reporting physical effects, and the arrival of military investigators treating it all seriously rather than dismissing your experiences. Imagine the mixture of validation. Someone official believes something is happening, and fear. Something is happening that even the military can't fully explain or stop. The Amazon Delta continues its ancient rhythms, rivers flowing, jungle growing, communities living their lives. The lights that appeared over Colares in 1977 haven't returned in the same intensity, though occasional reports still emerge from the region. The photographs and documents from Operation Saucer sit in archives, available now for researchers to examine. Physical evidence of a time when the Brazilian Air Force took UFO reports seriously enough to investigate for months. Whatever caused the Colares flap remains uncertain, but that it occurred, that something disrupted that community for months and prompted an extensive official investigation, that much is documented fact, strange and unsettling as it may be. There's a particular weight that photographs carry in UFO cases. Witness testimony can be dismissed as misperception or fabrication. Radar returns can be explained as anomalies. But photographs, especially photographs taken before the age of digital manipulation, represent something physical, something that can be analyzed and examined. The Trinidad Island photographs of 1958 remain among the most studied and debated UFO images ever captured, particularly because of the circumstances under which they were taken and the number of witnesses present. Trinidad Island is a small, rocky island in the South Atlantic, about 680 miles off the coast of Brazil. In 1958, it was the site of a Brazilian Navy research station, part of activities related to International Geophysical Year. The Navy transport ship Almirante Saldanha was docked at the island, conducting operations and preparing to depart with personnel who had been stationed there. On January 16, 1958, around noon, with the ship preparing to leave, something unusual appeared in the sky. A Saturn-shaped object, a disk with a ring or dome structure visible, approached the island at high speed, slowed, maneuvered near some of the rocky peaks, and then departed, accelerating rapidly and disappearing from view. The key witness was Almiro Baraúna, a professional photographer who was on board the ship. Baraúna had his camera with him, a Rolleiflex, a professional-grade twin-lens reflex camera loaded with black and white film. As the object appeared, multiple people on deck pointed and shouted, drawing attention to it. Baraúna grabbed his camera and managed to capture 6 photographs of the object as it maneuvered near the island before departing. The photographs show a dark, disc-shaped object with a distinct shape against the sky and rocky island terrain. The object appears in different positions relative to the island's peaks across the sequence of shots, suggesting motion. The images are clear enough to show the object's shape, but distant enough that fine detail isn't visible. They look exactly like what you'd expect from a professional photographer using 1950s film technology to capture something unexpected at a distance. Not perfectly clear, but clear enough to be provocative. What makes these photographs particularly significant is the chain of custody and the number of witnesses. Barahona didn't develop the film himself in private. He was asked to develop it immediately on the ship, under the supervision of naval officers. The ship's captain and crew watched as he processed the negatives. The images were examined by multiple naval personnel before the ship even left the area. According to various accounts, dozens of people on the ship witnessed the object itself. Exact numbers vary depending on the source, but estimates generally range from 48 to over 100 witnesses, including officers, enlisted personnel, and civilians. This wasn't a lone photographer claiming to have captured something with no corroboration. This was a mass sighting accompanied by photographic documentation. The Brazilian Navy conducted an investigation. The photographs were analyzed by naval intelligence. The negatives were examined for signs of tampering or double exposure. The consensus from this official investigation was that the photographs appeared to be genuine, not fabricated or manipulated, and that they showed an unidentified object over Trindade Island. The Brazilian government publicly released these photographs and acknowledged the incident, which was unusual for military UFO cases. President Juscelino Kubitschek was even briefed on the case. The photographs appeared in newspapers and magazines in Brazil and internationally, becoming some of the most widely distributed UFO images of the era. Naturally, skepticism and alternative explanations emerged. Some researchers have suggested that Barahona, who had an interest in UFOs and had previously created fake UFO photographs as jokes or experiments, might have fabricated these images as well. The theory is that he could have created a model, photographed it in a way that made it appear distant, and then passed it off as a genuine UFO sighting, taking advantage of the confusion of the moment and the many witnesses who saw something, even if it wasn't what appeared in the photographs. This theory faces some challenges, though. The photographs were developed under supervision immediately after being taken, which would have required remarkable sleight of hand to substitute fraudulent film. The witnesses who saw the object described something consistent with what appears in the photographs, and Barahona's previous joke photographs were clearly different in character, more obviously fake, created explicitly as demonstrations of photographic techniques, not attempts to deceive. Other skeptics have proposed that the object might have been an aircraft or weather balloon, photographed at an angle that made it appear more unusual than it was, or that atmospheric conditions created an optical effect that appeared solid and structured. But these explanations struggle with the specific shape visible in the photographs. The Saturn-like form with a central disk and ring structure doesn't match common aircraft or balloon configurations. Some analysis of the photographs has focused on technical details: the grain structure of the film, the lighting consistency between the object and the surrounding scene, the way shadows fall. Professional photo analysts who've examined the images have generally concluded they don't show obvious signs of manipulation, though this doesn't prove the object was extraordinary. Just that if it was a hoax, It was a well-executed one using techniques that don't leave obvious traces in the negatives. The Trinidad Island case represents one of those frustrating situations where we have seemingly strong evidence. Photographs taken in front of dozens of witnesses, processed under supervision, examined by military experts, and yet no definitive proof of anything extraordinary. The photographs show something certainly. Whether that something is a genuine, unidentified object, a clever hoax, or a misidentified, ordinary object remains debated more than 65 years later. What's perhaps most interesting is how the case was handled officially. The Brazilian Navy investigated, acknowledged the photographs as apparently genuine, and released them publicly. This transparency is relatively rare in military UFO cases. There was no attempt to suppress the images or dismiss the witnesses. The official position was essentially, this happened, we have photographs and witnesses, we don't know what it was, and we're making this information public. The photographs themselves have aged in interesting ways. In 1958, they were among the clearest UFO photographs ever taken, detailed enough to show shape and structure, taken by a professional photographer with known equipment, witnessed by dozens. Today, in an era of digital manipulation and computer-generated imagery, photographs carry less weight as evidence. We're more skeptical of images, more aware of how easily they can be faked. The Trinidad photographs would be less impressive if taken today, but in their time, they represented something significant. Apparent, documentary evidence of an unexplained object, officially acknowledged and widely witnessed. As you sink deeper into rest, consider the peculiar nature of photographic evidence. A photograph should settle questions, should provide definitive documentation of what occurred. But the Trinidad photographs, like so many UFO images, somehow manage to do the opposite. They raise as many questions as they answer, provide material for both belief and skepticism, and ultimately leave us uncertain, despite being physical evidence that we can hold, examine, and analyze. The object in those photographs, whatever it was, appeared over Trinidad Island for a few minutes on a summer day in 1958, was captured on film, and then departed, leaving behind images that have been scrutinized, debated, and pondered for decades, never quite proving anything definitively, but never quite fading into irrelevance either. There's a particular challenge that comes with UFO evidence in the modern era. We have better cameras, better recording equipment, better technology for capturing and analyzing unusual phenomena. But we also have better tools for fabricating false evidence, for creating convincing hoaxes, for manipulating video and images in ways that are nearly undetectable. So when UFO footage emerges that's clear enough to show detail, we're faced with a paradox. The better the evidence looks, the more suspicious we become that it might be fabricated. The Kumburgaz UFO videos, filmed between 2007 and 2009 in Turkey, exist in this uncomfortable space. They show, or appear to show, objects in extraordinary detail that's rare in UFO footage. And this very clarity has made them both celebrated as potentially the best UFO footage ever captured and dismissed as likely hoaxes. Kumburgaz is a small town on the coast of the Sea of Marmara in Turkey, not far from Istanbul. Yalçın Yalman, a night security guard who worked near the coast, developed a habit of scanning the horizon with his video camera during his night shifts. Turkey had been experiencing a wave of UFO sightings during this period, and Yalman, interested in the phenomenon, would occasionally capture lights or unusual objects in the distance over the water. But between 2007 and 2009, Yalman captured something more remarkable. On multiple occasions, over different nights and months, he filmed what appeared to be structured craft hovering in the distance over the sea. The objects were typically visible during the early morning hours, in the pre-dawn darkness when the sky was still black, but there was enough ambient light for the camera to capture images. What makes these videos extraordinary or extraordinarily suspicious, depending on your perspective, is the level of detail visible in some of the footage. Using a camera with a powerful zoom lens, Yalman captured close-up footage of these objects that shows apparent structure, what some interpret as windows or portholes, lights in various configurations, and in some of the most controversial sections, what appear to be figures or shapes visible within or behind these window-like openings. The footage is grainy and unstable. Yalman was hand-holding a camera at maximum zoom, filming at night over considerable distance, so the image jumps and loses focus frequently. But in the clearer moments, the objects appear disc-shaped or dome-shaped, with lights around their perimeter, and these darker sections that might be windows. In some frames, within these darker sections, shapes are visible that some viewers interpret as beings, heads, figures, entities of some kind observing outward. These videos were analyzed by various researchers and organizations. The Turkish UFO research organization, Sirius UFO Space Sciences Research Center, conducted investigations, interviewing witnesses, and examining the footage. They noted that multiple witnesses, besides Yalman, reported seeing unusual objects over the Sea of Marmara during this period, though Yalman's footage was the most detailed. The videos were also examined by academics, including researchers from Istanbul University and Akdeniz University. Some of these analyses focused on ruling out conventional explanations. Were these cruise ships seen from a distance, their superstructures and lights creating an unusual appearance? Were they fishing boats or other maritime vessels? The researchers noted that the objects appeared to be hovering above the water rather than floating on it, and their light configurations didn't match typical maritime vessels. International researchers have examined the videos frame by frame, looking for signs of computer-generated imagery or physical model photography. Some analysts have noted that the lighting and the way reflections appear on the objects seem consistent with real objects being filmed in real lighting conditions rather than CGI, though this analysis is complicated by the quality and nature of the footage. Skeptical explanations have focused on several possibilities. The most common suggestion is that Yalman was filming cruise ships or other large vessels at a distance, under atmospheric conditions that created unusual distortion and made the ships appear to hover. The Sea of Marmara is a busy maritime corridor, and ships are frequently visible from shore, especially at night when their lights stand out against the darkness. Some skeptics have pointed to specific cruise ships that were in the area during the times Yalman was filming, suggesting that the windows were cabin lights and the overall shapes match the superstructures of these vessels. They've noted that atmospheric refraction and temperature inversions can create unusual visual effects, making objects on the horizon appear to float above it, distorting their shapes in ways that might make a ship look more mysterious than it actually is. Other skeptical researchers have suggested the footage might be a deliberate hoax. Perhaps physical models, filmed in a way that makes them appear distant, or even clever CGI created to simulate authentic handheld camera footage. Yalman had no apparent financial motive initially. He wasn't selling the footage or seeking publicity. But as the videos gained attention, the possibility of fabrication for fame or attention became part of the skeptical analysis. What complicates any analysis is that we're looking at footage of distant objects captured under poor lighting conditions with a camera at maximum zoom. At these settings, almost anything could be made to look unusual. The human tendency to see patterns and familiar shapes, pareidolia, means that the ambiguous shapes visible in some frames could be interpreted as figures or beings when they might just be random structures, lights, or artifacts of the filming process. Yet some researchers who've examined the footage remain convinced it shows something genuinely anomalous. They point to the stability of the image in some sequences. Despite the camera shake, the object itself maintains consistent proportions and structure, suggesting it's a real three-dimensional object being filmed rather than a flat image or projection. They note details in the lighting and reflection that seem difficult to fake with the technology available to an amateur in the late 2000s. And they emphasize that multiple witnesses reported seeing similar objects during this period, not just Yalman. The beings visible in some of the footage remain the most controversial aspect. In certain frames, within the darker sections interpreted as windows, shapes are visible that some viewers see as heads or upper bodies of figures. These shapes show what might be eyes, what might be the contours of faces or heads. They appear in multiple frames across different nights of footage, suggesting either consistent hoaxing or genuine repeated observation of something structured and occupied. Skeptics understandably point out that seeing faces or figures in ambiguous shapes is a powerful human tendency. We see faces in clouds, in wood grain, in random patterns. Our brains are wired to recognize faces even in minimal information. The beings in the Kumbergaz footage might be nothing more than this tendency applied to the lights and shadows of distant ships or hoaxed models. What's frustrating about the Kumbergaz case is that it feels tantalizingly close to being definitive evidence, but ultimately remains inconclusive. If the footage is genuine, it represents some of the clearest documentation of structured craft, and potentially even their occupants ever captured. If it's a hoax or misidentification, it's a compelling reminder of how easily our perceptions can be deceived, and how difficult it is to prove anything definitively from video footage alone. Yalman himself maintained throughout that he was simply filming what he saw, that he had no explanation for the objects, and that he was as puzzled by them as anyone else. He faced both celebration from UFO believers and accusation of fraud from skeptics, finding himself in the uncomfortable position of being the center of attention for something he claimed not to understand. The footage exists, available for anyone to watch and form their own conclusions. Multiple versions have been released, some with stabilization and enhancement applied, others raw as originally captured. Researchers continue to debate its authenticity and meaning, with no consensus emerging. It exists in that frustrating space where it's clear enough to be interesting, but not clear enough to be definitive, detailed enough to provoke analysis, but ambiguous enough to resist final explanation. As you drift further into sleep, consider the challenge of evidence in the modern age. We have the technology to capture extraordinary detail, but also the technology to fabricate it. We have analysis tools that can detect many forms of fakery, but hoaxers have access to sophisticated tools as well. The Kumbergaz videos, whatever they show, remind us that even when we have footage, even when we can watch and rewatch and analyze frame by frame, certainty remains elusive. The objects in those videos, whether ships seen strangely, elaborate hoaxes, or genuine unknowns, hover in their ambiguity much as they appeared to hover over the Sea of Marmara, neither clearly one thing nor another, inviting interpretation, but resisting final judgment. There's something almost comically dramatic about UFOs appearing over the nation's capital, particularly when they do so not once but twice, separated by exactly 1 week, as if deliberately making a point. The Washington, D.C. UFO incidents of July 1952 forced the U.S. government to hold its largest press conference since World War II, and remain among the most documented and officially acknowledged UFO events in American history. The first incident occurred on the night of July 1920, 1952. It was a warm summer weekend in Washington, and National Airport, now Reagan National Airport, was operating normally, with air traffic controllers monitoring their radar screens in the tower. Shortly before midnight, the controllers began noticing unusual returns on their radar. Objects that didn't correspond to known aircraft, moving in ways that didn't match standard flight patterns. At first, they assumed it was some kind of technical malfunction or radar anomaly. But as they watched, the objects continued to appear, moving across the screens in intelligent patterns, accelerating, decelerating, making sharp turns, sometimes hovering. The objects weren't following any registered flight plans, weren't responding to radio contact, and their speeds varied from very slow to extraordinarily fast. The controllers weren't the only ones seeing these returns. 2 other radar installations in the area, at Andrews Air Force Base and at another airport facility, were picking up the same objects. 3 independent radar systems tracking the same anomalous returns simultaneously makes equipment malfunction or weather-related false echoes much less likely as an explanation. The objects were being detected by multiple systems using different equipment in different locations. Then came the visual confirmations. Pilots flying in the area reported seeing unusual lights, bright orange objects that would hover, then accelerate rapidly away. Some of these visual sightings correlated with the radar returns, meaning that whatever was being tracked on radar was also visible to pilots in the air. This combination of radar detection and visual confirmation is particularly significant in UFO cases. It rules out either pure equipment error or pure optical illusion. As the night continued, the decision was made to scramble fighter jets to investigate. F-94 starfighters were launched from Newcastle Air Force Base in Delaware. By the time the jets arrived over Washington, most of the objects had disappeared from radar. The jets found nothing unusual and returned to base. As soon as they departed, the objects reappeared on radar. This pattern would repeat. When interceptors were in the area, the objects would vanish. When the jets left, they'd return. One pilot did manage to see something. Lieutenant William Patterson reported being vectored toward an object, seeing a bright white light ahead of him, and then suddenly being surrounded by a ring of blue-white lights. He described feeling anxious about the situation. These lights were around his aircraft. He didn't know what they were, and they didn't respond to any attempts at identification. Then the lights simply vanished, and he was alone in the sky again. The incident continued until dawn, with objects appearing and disappearing on radar, with occasional visual sightings by pilots and even some ground observers who reported seeing unusual lights over the Capitol and the White House. As the sun rose and air traffic increased with the beginning of the normal day's operations, the objects gradually disappeared. Naturally, such an incident over the nation's capital couldn't remain secret. News reports began appearing, questioning what had happened, whether it represented a threat, what the government knew about it. The Air Force issued brief statements suggesting that weather conditions and temperature inversions might have caused false radar returns. Then, exactly 1 week later, on the night of July 26, 27, it happened again. The same radar installations picked up similar objects. Pilots again reported visual sightings of unusual lights. The pattern was so similar to the previous week that it seemed almost deliberate, as if whatever was responsible was making a point about its ability to appear over the nation's most sensitive airspace. This time, jets were scrambled more quickly and stayed in the area longer. Again, the objects seemed to avoid the interceptors, though some pilots reported brief visual contact with lights that accelerated away at speeds far beyond their ability to follow. One pilot, Captain John McHugo, reported seeing a light that was about the same as a star, that then accelerated away at extraordinary speed. The repetition of the incident, its occurrence over the Capitol, and the growing public interest forced a response. On July 29, 1952, the Air Force held a press conference at the Pentagon, the largest gathering of media since World War II. Major General John Samford, the Air Force Director of Intelligence, addressed the press and the nation. Samford's explanation centered on temperature inversions, atmospheric conditions where layers of air at different temperatures create false radar returns. He suggested that under certain conditions, radar beams could be bent or reflected in ways that made ground targets or other objects appear to be in the sky. He acknowledged that the visual sightings by pilots were harder to explain, but suggested they might have been influenced by the excitement of the moment and the ambiguity of lights seen at night. It was a careful, measured response designed to provide a conventional explanation while acknowledging that uncertainty remained. Samford didn't mock the witnesses or dismiss the incidents as nonsense. He treated them as genuine observations that the Air Force believed could be explained by atmospheric phenomena, though he couldn't prove this definitively. The temperature inversion explanation has been debated extensively in the decades since. Meteorological records from those nights do show conditions that could have created some unusual radar effects. Temperature inversions can indeed cause radar anomalies under certain circumstances. But several aspects of the Washington incidents don't fit neatly into this explanation. Temperature inversions typically create stable false returns that don't move rapidly or make sharp turns. The objects tracked over Washington were described by radar operators as displaying intelligent, controlled movement, accelerating from slow speeds to thousands of miles per hour, making right-angle turns, appearing to avoid interceptors. While experienced radar operators might occasionally be fooled by atmospheric effects, the operators that night were experienced professionals who were familiar with temperature inversion effects and didn't believe that's what they were seeing. The visual sightings by pilots complicate the purely meteorological explanation. While it's possible for atmospheric conditions to create unusual optical effects, the correlation between radar returns and visual sightings, seeing unusual lights in locations where radar showed objects, suggests something more concrete than pure atmospheric phenomena. Some researchers have suggested that the incidents might have involved a combination of factors. Perhaps some radar returns were weather-related, but genuine unknown objects were also present, taking advantage of the confusion to conduct whatever observations or activities brought them to Washington's airspace. Others have proposed classified military tests or experimental aircraft, though why such tests would be conducted over the nation's capital and repeated exactly 1 week later isn't clear. What's perhaps most significant about the Washington flap is how it was handled. Unlike many UFO incidents that were dismissed, mocked, or classified into obscurity, the Washington incidents forced official acknowledgement and public explanation. The Air Force couldn't ignore something that had happened twice over the Capitol, been tracked by multiple radar systems, and witnessed by pilots and ground observers. They had to respond, and that response, a major press conference with a detailed explanation, set a precedent for how authorities would handle high-profile UFO events. The incidents also led to increased military attention to UFO reports. Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official UFO investigation program, was already in existence. But the Washington flap emphasized the potential security implications of unexplained objects appearing over sensitive locations. Whether these were atmospheric phenomena, foreign technology, or something else entirely, the fact that they'd appeared twice over the Capitol suggested a need for serious investigation rather than casual dismissal. As sleep pulls you deeper, imagine the radar operators that night, watching their screens as objects appeared, moved in impossible ways, vanished when jets approached, and reappeared when they left. Imagine the pilots, vectored toward targets they could sometimes see but never quite catch, bright lights that would accelerate away into the night sky. Imagine the officials making decisions about how to respond, how to explain, how to balance public concern with the uncertainty of not knowing what was actually occurring in the skies over the nation's capital. The skies over Washington returned to normal after those July nights in 1952. Decades have passed, countless aircraft have taken off and landed from the area's airports, and life has continued in its regular patterns. But for 2 weekends in the summer of 1952, something unusual had the nation's attention, had appeared on radar screens and in the night sky, and had prompted the largest military press conference since the war. Whatever those objects were, atmospheric phenomena, unknown aircraft, or something else entirely, they made their presence known in a way that couldn't be ignored, and then departed, leaving behind radar records, pilot testimony, and questions that persist more than 70 years later. There's a particular credibility that comes with official military investigations, conducted with thoroughness and transparency. When a government agency not only investigates a UFO, incident, but publicly releases their findings and acknowledges they couldn't explain what was observed. It represents a refreshing departure from the usual pattern of dismissal or classification. The Chilean Navy's investigation of a 2014 incident, released publicly in 2017, represents this kind of transparent approach to an unexplained aerial phenomenon. On November 11, 2014, a Chilean Navy helicopter was conducting a routine daytime patrol flight along the coast, about 35 miles northwest of Santiago. Aboard were the pilot, a Navy captain with many years of flying experience, and a Navy technician operating the helicopter's sophisticated Wescam MX-15 infrared camera system. The weather was clear, with excellent visibility. Not the kind of conditions where misidentification of ordinary objects would be likely. Around 4 p.m., the technician noticed something unusual on his infrared display. An object was visible in the sky ahead of them, appearing as a distinct thermal signature. He pointed it out to the pilot, who could also see it visually. A strange, flattened object that didn't correspond to any aircraft they were familiar with. It appeared to be moving at roughly the same speed and direction as the helicopter, perhaps slightly faster. The pilot attempted to contact the object by radio, using standard aviation frequencies. No response. He tried multiple times, transmitting on emergency frequencies, but the object never responded to any communication attempts. Meanwhile, the technician kept the infrared camera trained on it, capturing detailed footage of whatever it was. The object appeared to be approximately 30 to 40 feet long, with a flat, elongated shape. What made it particularly unusual in the infrared footage was what appeared to be two plumes of hot material being released from the object at intervals. These plumes were clearly visible in the thermal imaging. They were significantly warmer than the surrounding air, trailing behind the object like some kind of exhaust or discharge, though not resembling typical aircraft exhaust patterns. The crew contacted two separate radar stations, one civilian, one military, to ask if they were tracking the object. Both radar installations confirmed they were not showing anything unusual in that location. So here was something that was clearly visible to the crew both visually and on infrared, but invisible to radar. This is an unusual combination. Typically, anything solid enough to have a thermal signature would also reflect radar waves. The helicopter followed the object for approximately 9 minutes, with the infrared camera recording continuously. During this time, the object released two distinct plumes of material, both captured clearly on the thermal imaging. The plumes expanded and dispersed as they mixed with the surrounding air, but they were definitely being expelled from the object, not simply trailing behind it. Then, after about 9 minutes of observation, the object simply disappeared, not flew away at high speed, not descended out of sight. It just ceased to be visible both to the naked eye and on the infrared camera. One moment it was there, clearly visible and being tracked, and the next moment it was gone. The Chilean Navy's Committee for the Study of Anomalous Aerial Phenomena, CEFAA, received the report and began an investigation that would last over 2 years. This wasn't a cursory review. They conducted a thorough, multidisciplinary investigation involving meteorologists, physicists, aviation experts, and image analysis specialists. The investigation ruled out a series of conventional explanations. It wasn't a commercial aircraft. Wrong shape, no response to radio communication, and invisible to radar. It wasn't a drone. The size and behavior didn't match available drone technology, and no drone operations were registered in that area at that time. It wasn't a bird or flock of birds. The thermal signature was wrong, the shape was inconsistent, and the plumes being expelled ruled out biological explanations. The meteorologists examined whether the object could be some kind of atmospheric phenomenon or weather balloon. But the shape, movement, and especially the expelled plumes didn't fit any known atmospheric effects. Weather balloons don't move horizontally at consistent speeds, don't release thermal plumes, and typically appear differently on infrared. The possibility of foreign aircraft or experimental technology was considered, but no country had or has since acknowledged having aircraft with the capability to be invisible to radar while remaining visible in infrared and to the naked eye, while also releasing hot material in the manner observed. The image analysis was particularly thorough. Frame-by-frame examination of the infrared video showed the plumes being expelled, expanding, and dispersing in ways consistent with actual material being released, rather than artifacts of the camera system or digital manipulation. The analysis confirmed the footage was genuine and unmanipulated. What the camera captured was really what was in front of it. After 2 years of investigation involving multiple experts and exhaustive analysis, CFAA released their findings in January 2017. Their conclusion: the object remained unidentified. They couldn't determine what it was, where it came from, or what the expelled material was. The report was detailed, professional, and refreshingly humble about the limits of their analysis. They didn't claim it was extraterrestrial, didn't engage in speculation beyond what the evidence supported, but they acknowledged that their investigation had failed to identify the object using conventional explanations. What makes this case remarkable isn't just the quality of the footage or the credibility of the witnesses. It's the transparency of the investigation and the willingness to publicly acknowledge uncertainty. Many countries, when faced with unexplained military encounters, either deny them, classify them indefinitely, or offer explanations that don't quite account for all the observed details. Chile's approach: conduct a serious investigation using multiple disciplines, make a genuine effort to find a conventional explanation, and then publicly acknowledge when that effort doesn't succeed, represents a more mature approach to unexplained phenomena. The footage itself is striking to watch. Unlike many UFO videos that show ambiguous lights at night or distant objects that could be anything, the Chilean Navy video shows a distinct object in clear conditions, captured by professional equipment operated by trained personnel. The expelled plumes are particularly fascinating. You can watch them emerge from the object, expand, and disperse, visible as hot material mixing with cooler air. Whatever the object was releasing, it was real enough to show up as a thermal signature. From a scientific standpoint, the Chilean case is valuable precisely because it resists easy explanation while being well documented. It provides data that can be analyzed: infrared footage showing thermal characteristics, visual observations from experienced pilots, timing and location information, and the negative result of radar searches. All of this creates a detailed record of something unexplained, the kind of case that serious researchers can examine and re-examine. Skeptics have continued to propose explanations even after the official investigation concluded. Some have suggested It might have been a commercial aircraft with unusual atmospheric conditions, creating false thermal signatures. Others have proposed elaborate scenarios involving drones or experimental craft that somehow avoided radar detection. But none of these alternative explanations quite account for all the observed characteristics, and they require us to discount the 2-year official investigation conducted by experts specifically tasked with finding a conventional explanation. What the Chilean Navy case really represents is an honest acknowledgement of the limits of our knowledge. Here was something observed in detail by trained professionals using sophisticated equipment, investigated thoroughly by multiple experts over 2 years. And at the end of all that effort, the conclusion was simply, we don't know, not a cover-up, not a dismissal, not a forced explanation that doesn't quite fit, just an honest acknowledgement that sometimes, even with good evidence and serious investigation, we encounter things we cannot currently explain. As you settle into deeper rest, consider the refreshing honesty of that conclusion. In a world where we often feel pressure to have answers, where uncertainty is treated as weakness, there's something almost peaceful about acknowledging that some questions remain open. The Chilean Navy pilots saw something, captured it on thermal imaging, attempted to identify it using all available methods, and then handed it over to experts who investigated it thoroughly and arrived at uncertainty. And rather than hiding that uncertainty or manufacturing a convenient explanation, they released their findings publicly, acknowledging the mystery while maintaining scientific rigor. The skies over Chile continue their ancient patterns, winds from the Pacific meeting the coastal mountains, birds and aircraft following their regular routes. Whatever the object was that appeared that November afternoon in 2014, it had its brief moment of observation, released its mysterious plumes, and then vanished, leaving behind 9 minutes of infrared footage and a thorough official report that concluded, essentially, with a shrug. Sometimes that's the most honest answer we can give. We saw something, we documented it, we investigated it, and we still don't know what it was. And perhaps that admission of uncertainty, that scientific humility, is itself valuable. A reminder that the world still contains genuine mysteries, even when examined by experts using sophisticated tools. Sometimes the most significant UFO-related developments aren't dramatic sightings or close encounters, but rather subtle shifts in how official institutions acknowledge and prepare for unexplained aerial phenomena. In 2020, Japan's Ministry of Defense made a quiet but meaningful announcement that revealed how attitudes toward UFOs were changing at the highest levels of government and military planning. In September 2020, Japan's Defense Minister Taro Kono announced that the Self-Defense Forces, Japan's military, would establish new protocols for how pilots and personnel should respond to encounters with unidentified aerial phenomena. This wasn't prompted by any specific recent incident that was made public, but rather by a recognition that such encounters were possible and that having established procedures made practical sense. The announcement came in the context of similar policy changes by the United States military. Just a few months earlier, the U.S. Pentagon had officially released several UFO videos captured by Navy pilots and had acknowledged the existence of ongoing investigations into what they were now calling unidentified aerial phenomena, or UAPs rather than UFOs. a rebranding intended to remove some of the cultural stigma and science fiction associations from the topic. Japan's decision to create official protocols represents a significant philosophical shift. For decades, the standard institutional response to UFO reports was somewhere between dismissal and ridicule. Pilots who reported unusual encounters often felt pressure to stay silent to avoid damaging their professional credibility. The phenomenon was treated as fringe, not worthy of serious attention from defense or aviation authorities. But the creation of official protocols sends a different message. These encounters might occur. They should be taken seriously, and personnel should have clear guidance on how to respond. The protocols, as described in public statements, include procedures for how pilots should attempt to observe and document unusual objects, how they should report such encounters through proper channels, and how these reports should be collected and analyzed rather than dismissed or buried. The Japanese protocols also addressed a key practical concern: aviation safety. Even if unidentified objects turn out to have mundane explanations, drones, balloons, experimental aircraft, atmospheric phenomena, they represent potential hazards to aviation. Pilots need to know how to respond to unexpected objects in their airspace, and having established procedures ensures that these encounters are handled professionally and safely. What makes Japan's approach particularly interesting is its explicit connection to national security. The protocols were developed partly in response to concerns about foreign surveillance technology. China, Russia, and other nations have been developing increasingly sophisticated drones and high-altitude reconnaissance capabilities. Some unidentified aerial phenomena might represent these technologies, and having proper reporting and investigation procedures serves legitimate defense intelligence purposes. This national security framing actually helps remove some of the stigma from UFO reporting. When pilots report unusual objects, they're not being believers or nuts. They're doing their job of maintaining awareness of potential threats in national airspace. The objects might be advanced foreign technology. They might be weather phenomena. They might be misidentified conventional aircraft, or they might be something else entirely. But whatever they are, they deserve professional documentation and investigation. The Japanese protocols also include provisions for information sharing with allies, particularly the United States. As both nations develop new approaches to UAP investigations, they recognized that coordination would be valuable. An object seen by Japanese pilots off the coast of Japan might also appear in areas monitored by U.S. forces, and sharing data could help both nations better understand what they're encountering. What's perhaps most significant about Japan's move is how unremarkable it was made to seem. The announcement didn't generate significant controversy or debate. It was presented as a sensible, practical measure. Of course, the military should have procedures for unusual aerial encounters, just as they have procedures for all other aspects of operations. By framing it as a routine update to operational protocols rather than a dramatic acknowledgement of UFO reality, Japan normalized the idea that unexplained phenomena deserve serious institutional attention. This approach, treating UAP encounters as a legitimate area for professional protocols and investigation rather than as a fringe topic to be avoided, represents a broader shift happening across multiple countries. France has had an official UFO investigation office, GAPAN, since the 1970s. Chile's CEFAA, as we discussed earlier, conducts serious investigations of unexplained aerial phenomena. Several other nations have established similar offices or procedures in recent years. What these institutional developments suggest is a growing recognition that the topic deserves to be separated from its cultural baggage. Whether UAPs represent extraterrestrial visitation, foreign surveillance technology, advanced natural phenomena we don't yet understand, or some combination of these and other explanations, they're observed regularly enough by credible witnesses that dismissing them or ignoring them is no longer seen as a reasonable institutional response. The Japanese protocols include provisions for data collection and analysis. Reports from pilots and other personnel are to be systematically collected and analyzed for patterns. This represents a shift from viewing each unusual sighting as an isolated incident to understanding them as potentially related phenomena that might reveal patterns or characteristics through systematic study. There's also a recognition that stigma itself has been a problem. When pilots fear ridicule or professional consequences for reporting unusual sightings, valuable safety and intelligence information is lost. By creating official channels and procedures, removing the stigma and replacing it with professional expectations, institutions can access data that was previously hidden by fear of mockery. The shift in terminology from UFO to UAP is part of this destigmatization effort. Unidentified flying object carries decades of cultural associations. Alien abductions, conspiracy theories, science fiction. Unidentified aerial phenomena is more neutral, more scientific, less loaded with assumptions. It simply describes what we know. Something was observed in the air, and we haven't identified it yet. As you drift toward sleep, consider what it means that major military powers are quietly creating official procedures for something they spent decades denying or dismissing. It suggests a pragmatic recognition that uncertainty exists, that our skies occasionally contain things we don't immediately understand, and that professional, systematic approaches to these uncertainties serve practical purposes regardless of what the ultimate explanations might be. Japan's self-defense force pilots now have clear guidance. If you see something unusual, observe it carefully. Document what you can. Report it through proper channels. And know that your report will be taken seriously rather than becoming a source of professional embarrassment. It's a small shift, perhaps, but meaningful. An acknowledgement that the unknown deserves professional attention. That mystery isn't something to be avoided or mocked, but rather documented and investigated with scientific rigor and institutional seriousness. The skies over Japan continue their patterns, commercial aircraft following their routes, defense forces maintaining their watchfulness, and the protocols now exist for how to respond if something unusual appears, not with panic, not with ridicule, but with professional observation, documentation, and reporting. It's a mature approach to uncertainty, an institutional acknowledgement that we don't have all the answers, and that creating systems to collect and analyze data about the unknown serves legitimate purposes regardless of what we ultimately discover about the nature of unexplained aerial phenomena. We've traveled together through 19 stories tonight, accounts from across the globe and across decades. each one documenting moments when people encountered something in the sky they couldn't immediately explain. And as you settle into the final edges of sleep, it's worth reflecting on what patterns emerge from these disparate accounts, what they might tell us not just about UFOs, but about how we approach mystery itself. One of the most striking patterns is how these encounters cluster around certain locations. Bodies of water appear again and again: the Sea of Marmara, the coast of Chile, the waters off San Diego. Military installations feature prominently: Air Force bases in England and the United States, Navy carrier groups, defense facilities, and nuclear sites have long been associated with increased UFO reports, though we haven't detailed those cases specifically tonight. Is this pattern meaningful? Perhaps. Bodies of water might offer advantages for observation if these phenomena are engaged in some kind of monitoring. The ocean covers most of Earth's surface, and activity above water might be less noticed than activity over populated land. Or perhaps the pattern is simpler. People tend to watch the sky more carefully near military installations and coastal areas, where they expect to see aircraft and ships, so unusual phenomena are more likely to be noticed and reported in these locations. Military installations attract attention for another reason. They're where advanced technology is tested and operated. Some UFO sightings near these facilities might well be classified military projects, our own advanced technology mistaken for something unknown. The challenge is that this explanation can't account for all cases, particularly those involving multiple independent witnesses and behaviors that exceed known capabilities. Another pattern worth noting is the evolution of official responses. Early encounters, like Roswell, were often met with rapid dismissals or explanations that changed suspiciously quickly. Mid-century cases like Washington, D.C., generated official press conferences, but with explanations that didn't fully satisfy. Modern cases like Chile's Navy encounter and Japan's protocol development show a shift toward transparency and systematic investigation. We're seeing a slow movement from dismissal toward acknowledgement that uncertainty exists and deserves serious attention. The quality of evidence has both improved and become more problematic with technology's advancement. We have better cameras, better radar, better sensors, but we also have better tools for fabrication and more public awareness of how evidence can be manipulated. The Nimitz encounter benefits from multiple sophisticated sensor systems, all tracking the same phenomena, making conventional explanation difficult. The Kumbergaz videos suffer from being too clear, too detailed, raising suspicions of hoaxing precisely because they show what UFO researchers have long wanted to see. Witness credibility emerges as both crucial and complicated. Military pilots like Commander Fravor are trained observers whose professional reputations give weight to their accounts. Children like those at aerial school are often seen as more honest, less invested in deception, yet also more suggestible and imaginative. Academic investigators like Dr. Mack bring scientific methodology, but also potential bias toward extraordinary interpretations. Each case requires weighing credibility against potential for error, neither dismissing witnesses nor accepting their interpretations uncritically. The gap between observation and explanation persists across decades of technological advancement. We can track objects on multiple radar systems simultaneously, capture them on infrared and optical systems, document them with professional-grade cameras operated by trained personnel, and still not know what we're looking at. This gap isn't closing as quickly as we might expect. Better technology for observation doesn't automatically translate to better explanation when what we're observing doesn't fit our existing categories. Perhaps what's most fascinating is how these encounters resist neat categorization. Some cases have plausible conventional explanations that don't quite account for all details. Others defy conventional explanation but lack the definitive proof needed to claim something extraordinary. Most sit in uncomfortable middle ground, well witnessed enough to take seriously, strange enough to puzzle, but ambiguous enough that certainty remains elusive. This ambiguity itself might be meaningful. If these phenomena represent natural processes we don't yet understand, ambiguity is exactly what we'd expect. We're encountering something real, but lack the framework to fully comprehend it. If they represent advanced technology from elsewhere, ambiguity might be intentional, a deliberate avoidance of definitive contact. If they're misidentifications and coincidences creating patterns where none truly exist, ambiguity is inherent to the process of seeing meaning in randomness. The most honest position might be one that holds multiple possibilities simultaneously without committing fully to any single explanation. Some UFO reports are certainly misidentifications. Venus, weather phenomena, conventional aircraft seen under unusual conditions. Some might be classified technology, our own or others, creating sightings that seem extraordinary but are actually terrestrial. And perhaps some represent genuinely unknown phenomena, whether natural processes we haven't discovered or something more exotic. What the clustering around water, military installations, and nuclear facilities might really tell us is less about where UFOs appear and more about where we're watching. We monitor these areas more carefully, have better instruments in place, and pay more attention to anomalies. The reports might reflect our observation patterns as much as any genuine clustering of phenomena. As you sink into sleep's embrace, let these stories and patterns settle without needing to resolve into certainty. The universe is vast beyond comprehension. Human knowledge is impressive but incomplete, and the sky above us has shown across centuries and cultures that it can still surprise us. Whether those surprises represent extraterrestrial visitation, advanced terrestrial technology, natural phenomena awaiting discovery, or the endlessly creative ways humans misinterpret the ordinary. Perhaps what matters most is that we remain curious, that we continue to look up with wonder, and that we approach mystery with both open minds and appropriate skepticism. The pattern that emerges most clearly from these 20 stories isn't about alien visitors or government conspiracies. It's about the enduring human relationship with the unknown. We see something we don't understand. We document it, we investigate it, we debate it, and often we're left still uncertain. But that uncertainty hasn't stopped us from continuing to watch the skies, continuing to report what we see, continuing to investigate and wonder and question. Perhaps the real value of these encounters isn't in proving or disproving any particular explanation, but in keeping us humble about how much we don't know, keeping us curious about phenomena that resist easy categorization, and keeping us attentive to the world around us. The sky has always held mysteries, and likely always will. Our ancestors watched unusual lights and created mythologies to explain them. We watch with sophisticated instruments and create different explanations, but the essential experience remains. Humans looking up at something they don't quite understand, trying to make sense of it, and carrying the wonder of that experience forward. Sleep now, letting these stories drift through your consciousness like stars moving across the night sky. Some bright and clear, others dim and ambiguous, all part of the vast pattern of human experience with the unknown. The questions they raise will still be there tomorrow, patient and persistent, waiting for those who choose to look up and wonder. But for now, let them simply be mysteries that don't demand immediate answers, phenomena that can exist in uncertainty, stories that invite contemplation without requiring conclusion. The sky continues above us, dark and vast, containing all the familiar celestial objects we've mapped and named, and perhaps, just perhaps, containing other things as well, things we haven't yet learned to recognize or understand. Either way, it's still beautiful, still worthy of our attention, still capable of showing us something that makes us pause and wonder. And that sense of wonder, that capacity to encounter the unexplained without immediately dismissing it or accepting it uncritically, might be the most valuable thing these stories offer. Rest now. The mysteries will keep. And so we've journeyed together through 20 encounters with the unexplained, 20 moments when people looked up and saw something that challenged their understanding of what's possible. From medieval Nuremberg to modern airports, from isolated valleys to bustling capitals, the reports continue. Each one a small thread in a larger tapestry of human experience with mystery. What these stories share isn't proof of any particular explanation, but rather a common element of wonder mixed with uncertainty. They remind us that despite all our technology and understanding, the world still holds surprises, still shows us things that resist immediate categorization. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be. A universe that can still astonish us. A sky that can still make us pause and question what we thought we knew. As you drift into sleep, let yourself be comfortable with the uncertainty these stories carry. Not every question needs an immediate answer. Not every mystery needs to be solved tonight. The sky will still be there tomorrow, vast and patient. And the questions these encounters raise will remain, waiting for those who choose to investigate with curiosity, rigor, and an appreciation for genuine mystery. Thank you for spending this time exploring these strange and fascinating accounts. May your dreams be peaceful, your rest deep, and your sense of wonder intact. The universe is vast, strange, and beautiful, and there's comfort in knowing that even with all we've learned, it can still surprise us. Good night. Retry.